Hey, everybody. Glad you're here tonight. We're going to have yet another great conversation. We got a great stream for tonight. So, go ahead and sit back and let's have a great conversation.
Spoken of the American century. I say that the century on which we are entering can be and must be the century of the common man.
A radical redistribution of economic power.
I mean, we know that racism is just a byproduct of capitalism. Everything would be all right if everything was put back in the hands of the people.
We need a government that will make sure Americans are taken care of and organize the economy to serve the people, not the profits of a wealthy few.
We now have the techniques and the resources to get rid of poverty.
We got to start getting out there with the people.
Get out of the movement and get to the masses.
We need a government of action.
Welcome, everybody. So glad that you're here. We're going to have yet another great late night chat. So the way we do things is first I give my opening remarks. Then after there, we do a roll call where I call you all out as I see you, names and locations. Then from there, I answer your questions for the remainder of the night. So if there's something you would like for me to answer in the second half of our program, all you need to do is you can send a Rumble rant if you're watching on Rumble. You can cash at me at CalebMoppin22. But the absolute best way, to send your questions for the second half of our show, the best way is to buy me a coffee. And somebody sent me a coffee this afternoon, and they said, hey, is it possible to send a coffee while you're not live? The answer is yes. So if you're watching this afterwards and you have a question for me, send a coffee and I'll answer it in the next show. That's a great way of doing things. So yeah, buy me a coffee, the best way to send questions for the second half of the show. Always appreciate it. As far as announcements, join the Center for Political Innovation. A lot of great things are happening. We're moving toward reserving the space. January 11th is going to be our next, CPI national event that we're having. It's going to be a gathering to kick off the new year on January 11th. And I do have a new announcement in addition to joining the Center for Political Innovation. This is kind of an interesting one. Not quite sure what will come of this, but we'll see. So we had our convention, our national convention in July, right? We're aiming to have a national convention every year now. So we decided that we would do something special, and we have published a book of the national convention. It is a full transcript of all of the speeches. It is in color. It is a full color book. This is a coffee table book that we published, basically, of the national gathering. It's called The Great Unity Convention, the proceedings of the 2025 National Gathering. I am sending one to the speakers. And if you come to our event on January 11th, you'll get your own free copy of it, complimentary, by attending the event. And if you want to buy it, you can get it on Amazon. It's a bit expensive because it's over 200 pages and it's full color images. You can buy it for yourself if you want. You can come to our event January 11th in New Jersey. Registration will be available soon. Or you can just buy it, and I'm sending a copy to the speakers. We decided, since our events are so awesome, and since we have very, very good documentation, very high quality images, we decided to publish a full-length book of the CPI National Gathering. I'm very excited. I'm going to pick up a couple copies from the printer very soon. And they have the Russian dancers there in front of our banner that said, "Long live the great unity of the people of the world." And the whole book is full of pictures, and it transcribes the speeches that were given. There's a number of CPI articles. There's timelines of our activities. It's basically a record of the 2025 National Gathering with full pictures, full color images. It's got articles in it. It's got, testimonials from members about what we do. It's got a timeline of our activities. This is our booklet for the 2025 National Gathering. And, if you want one, like I said, it's a bit expensive, but if you want one, you can order it off Amazon, or you can come to our event in January. I just thought I'd share that with all of you. Very exciting. You can join the Center for Political Innovation. get involved in our activities. So I just wanted to throw that out there. I think we're going to try to do that. It would be good if we had a book record of our events. So yeah, we have the book of the National Convention. Very exciting. So tonight's show follows the same format that we always use. First, I give my opening remarks, followed then by the roll call, followed after that by answering your questions for the remainder of the night. So if you have a question, if you got something you want me to talk about in the second half of the show, you can send me a Rumble rant. You can send me a Cash App at Caleb Moppin 22, but the best way, the absolute best way to send is buy me a coffee. So yeah, I'm going to jump right into it for tonight. First things first, happy birthday to someone that I do look up to and someone who I think has played a very, very important role in the history of the world, especially in his country. That is Russian President Vladimir Putin. Russian President Vladimir Putin has just turned 73 years old. And that 73 years old, and he doesn't look that old. He looks much younger than that, and he's 73, and today is his 73rd birthday. One of the first people to congratulate him was the leader of People's Korea, Kim Jong-un. North Korea and Russia are very close. This is the video they put out. It was circulating, honoring Kim Jong-un, sending congratulations to the Russian president. Yeah. So, it is the Russian president's birthday. So I wanted to just throw that out there. I have been paying close attention. Yes, it is a very, very nice car. I've been paying close attention to world events, and I can answer questions about world events, stuff like that. But tonight, I actually thought what I might do is go over the history of communism in Germany. Communist movements in Germany, and I have a number of songs, musical pieces from German communist history to play, clips of film, etc. And I just thought we would talk about German communist history. So that's what my opening remarks are going to be about tonight, the history of communism in Germany. So as you know, Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were of German descent. They lived in Germany, and they wrote the Communist Manifesto in 1848 because they led something called the Communist League that was participating in the 1848 German Revolution. There was no Germany in 1848. Germany did not yet exist as a country. There were a number of different feudal principalities, but there was a widespread uprising all throughout what we now consider to be Germany in 1848, demanding the creation of a democratic republic and a nation state for all of Germany. And all kinds of people fought in the German Revolution of 1848. And there were Marxists, followers of Karl Marx and the Communist League. There were Anabaptists, people that were opposed to baptizing children, very radical Protestants. There were people that advocated a democratic government, religious fanatics, all kinds of people revolted, demanding the creation of a modern German nation state. Richard Wagner, the famous composer, he was part of the 1848 German Revolution, had to go into exile. And Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels were part of the 1848 German Revolution, and they had to go into exile afterwards. And the Communist Manifesto was published as kind of their statement of principles, what they believed in, as one faction in the 1848 revolution that swept Germany. 1848 was a very, very important year. It was the spring of nations. There were over 200 revolts in Europe. Almost every European country had revolts. And it was the French Revolution. It happened the very end of the previous century. And it was the momentum of the French Revolution continuing to spread. And what people all over Europe were demanding was the creation of democratic republics and the overthrow of feudalism. And Germany, the rallying cry to create a German nation state, to create a German nation, to create a republic in Germany, the rallying cry of it was German nationalism. Right? Nationalism kind of comes out of the French Revolution, right? Nationalism, the concept of a nation state, the people of a nation. The French Revolution kind of gave birth to modern nationalism. And so, inspired by the French Revolution, all over Europe, you had people rising up, and they were called republicans because they wanted the creation of a democratic republic. And they were called nationalists because they wanted the creation of modern nation states. Republicanism and nationalism. And what was the anthem of the 1848 German Revolution? Deutschland, Deutschland, über alles. Deutschland, über all das Welt. Right? That is the anthem of the 1848 German Revolution. And peasants marched into battle to overthrow the landowning aristocracy, singing that song, because the idea of a modern German nation state was very, very revolutionary. And it would mean getting rid of the princes and the monarchs and the nobles and creating one German nation where they would have an elected government, where they would have freedom of speech and freedom of religion. It was quite inspiring. And it was Republicans all across the European mainland, and in Britain and in Scotland and all kinds of places. You had the 1848 Spring of Nations, and they lost epically, and all kinds of people had to flee and go into exile after the 1848 German Revolution. The actual German nation state didn't come into existence until much later, and you'll notice that at the end of the Communist Manifesto, right? When we talk about the Communist Manifesto, everyone loves to talk about it, but it's actually a very interesting document. You read it. The first section of the Communist Manifesto is praising capitalism, right? The first section of it is going on and on about how capitalism is this great system that has marched us into the modern world. And it's talking about how feudalism was holding people back. Feudalism stripped people of basic rights, etc. But because of capitalism, suddenly we have the modern world. Suddenly, we have gotten rid of all kinds of superstitions. But at the same time, we're losing something at the same time. And the Communist Manifesto, the opening section of it actually has an oddly conservative side to it. Let me see if I can pull it up here. Yeah. Right. This is the section of the Communist Manifesto that sounds oddly conservative. This is what it says. The bourgeoisie, wherever it has gotten the upper hand, has put an end to all feudal, patriarchal, and idyllic relations. It has pitilessly torn asunder the motley feudal ties that bound man to his natural superiors, and has left remaining no other nexus between man and man than naked self-interest, than callous cash payment. It has drowned the most heavenly ecstasies of religious fervor and chivalrous enthusiasm, of Philistine sentimentalism, in icy water of egotistical calculation. It has resolved personal worth into exchange value, and in place of numerous indefeasible chartered freedoms, it has set up a single unconscionable freedom: free trade. In one word, exploitation, veiled by religious and political illusions. It has substituted naked, shameless, direct, and brutal exploitation. The bourgeoisie is stripped of its halo, every occupation hitherto honored and looked upon with reverent awe, and has converted the physician, the lawyer, the priest, and the poet, the man of science, into its paid wage laborers. The bourgeoisie has torn away from the family its sentimental veil and reduced the family to a mere money relation. The first section of the Communist Manifesto is Karl Marx praising capitalism for playing this revolutionary role, but also pointing out that we lost something very, very special. I mean, we're losing our connections to other people. That's, callous cash payment. We're becoming cold, and we've lost our belief, and we've lost our principles, and callous exploitation, sentimental veils torn aside. Second section of the Communist Manifesto, as he says, capitalism has created this new class called the proletariat, the wage workers. And it basically says the wage workers are going to have no choice but to form combinations, labor unions, and that eventually there's going to need to be a political party to represent those labor unions. And eventually the proletarians will rise up and take control of the government. They will win the battle for democracy and centralize the instruments of production into the hands of the state. And that'll lay the basis for creating a huge amount of abundance and paving the road to a world of equality. And that's the second section. The third section of the Communist Manifesto is Karl Marx going over all these different kinds of socialism that existed at the time, most of which were people in Germany who were critical of capitalism because they wanted to go back to feudalism. And he talks about conservative socialism. He talks about noble or feudal socialism. He talks about what he calls German true socialism. But there were all these people in Germany at the time, long before Marx had ever showed up, that were critical of capitalism, but in a conservative way. They wanted to go back to feudalism. And Marx is saying, no, we don't want to go back to feudalism. And no, we're not criticizing capitalism for religious reasons. We're criticizing capitalism based in our dialectical materialist philosophy, and we want to march into the future. And that's the Communist Manifesto. And then it actually ends by saying that Germany is probably where the revolution is going to happen. It ends by saying we turn now to Germany. And because Germany was an up-and-coming nation, it was just coming into existence as a nation state, and because there had just been this big revolution there in 1848, this big revolution, he predicts basically that Germany is going to become the first communist country. That's how Karl Marx ends the Communist Manifesto, interestingly enough. A lot of people don't read the Communist Manifesto. It's one of these books people point to, but it's not very long. And I would recommend going through it with fresh eyes, not based on what you think it means. Go through it and just see what it says, because it's a lot of ideas packed into a lot of paragraphs. But basically, it begins praising capitalism for playing a revolutionary role while kind of mourning that capitalism has gotten rid of a lot of sacred and holy things and made kind of a cold world, where people are cruel to one another and don't care about each other. And then from there, it talks about how capitalism has created the working class and how the working class is very, very revolutionary and has no choice but to form labor unions and eventually a political party. And eventually the proletariat, the wage workers, are going to seize power. Then it ends by going over all these other kinds of socialism that it doesn't like. And it ends, the very end of the Communist Manifesto is also quite important. At the very end of the Communist Manifesto, it says communists support every uprising against the existing order of things. But in all of them, they bring forward the property question. And it ends by saying focus on Germany. And that's the Communist Manifesto. It's not that complex, actually, if you look at it. It's quite simple, and it's not very long. It's less than 100 pages, less than 60 pages. It's very much written in the idea of, look, here's what we stand for. And it's pretty outdated. A lot has happened since then. Now, obviously, certain ideas from it about history being a trajectory, right? First you have hunter-gatherer civilization, then that gives birth to slavery, then that gives birth to feudalism, then that gives birth to capitalism, and capitalism has this problem because now there's two class camps, wage workers and proletarians. That obviously stands. Understanding that capitalism has this problem of overproduction, where the economy breaks down because too many goods have been produced and the market gets glutted with products that cannot be sold. That's a big theme in the Communist Manifesto, that every couple years the economy comes to a grinding halt because we've produced too much wealth. That doesn't make any sense. And that as technology advances, you're going to have more unemployment and more economic instability. Marx is writing all of this, and he's just kind of observing certain patterns in the modern economy. Right? If you want to learn about Marx started out as a philosopher. He was a philosopher, and he developed a philosophical system called dialectical materialism, and he came out of the Hegelian tradition. Right? Hegel was a famous philosopher who really emphasized the notion of historical progress. And Hegelianism, out of Hegelianism, you had left Hegelianism and right Hegelianism. Marx was a left Hegelian who believed in historical progress through conflict. He rejected the notion of anything spiritual and argued that all that exists is matter. He was first a philosopher, and out of his philosophy, he got political. And then, forms the Communist League. He lives in Paris during the events that led to the coup of Louis Bonaparte. He eventually moves to London. In London, he's political. He's writing about, trying to build a communist working class movement. In London, he then becomes economic, and he becomes focused on economics. And Marx's life goes through these three stages of philosophy first, then politics on the foundation of his philosophy, and then economics on the foundation of his politics. And that's the writing career of Karl Marx. And that Marx, the main way Marx wrote was he wrote in terms of polemics, by arguing with other people. Other people had different ideas. There were all kinds of people going around criticizing capitalism, talking about new kinds of philosophy. And Marx is going around saying, my socialism, my critique of capitalism is the best. And that Marx called his socialism scientific socialism, as opposed to all the other kinds. To be back then, to be modern, meant you were scientific, meant you were not based on religion, you were not based on superstition or anything metaphysical. You were based on hard material science. So Marx went around saying, I have my scientific socialism, which is popular. And Marx went around pitching it to rich people. And he met a rich guy named Friedrich Engels who really liked his work. And he set up shop in London, and his ideas kind of flourished among revolutionary intellectuals. And he was saying that socialism would come into the world on the basis of organizing labor unions, right? All these other socialists basically were arguing that socialism would come into the world as a good idea, that they would go around promoting the idea of socialism. People would like the idea, and they would adopt it as an idea. And Proudhon talks about this, and all kinds of people talked about this. And Marx, his distinction was that he's saying, well, no, it's this wage working class, these proletarians, these wage workers, they have to be organized to seize control of the government. That is going to be the way that socialism comes into the world, not on the basis of us just going around saying it's a good idea, but rather on the basis of the wage workers, the proletarians. And, in 1875, which is pretty late in Marx's life, in Germany, there are so many people that are inspired by the socialist movement that they get together and they found the Social Democratic German Workers' Party. All right, let's back up, right? So Marx spent his life trying to build something called the International Working Men's Association, the IWA, or the First International. And the idea was that workers from all kinds of different countries would all come together into one single organization, and the workers of the world would come together and overthrow capitalism. And Marx spent his life trying to organize the International Working Men's Association. And it was not successful. And there was a lot of infighting and squabbling. And, they managed to have a lot of big international meetings. They managed to recruit a lot of effective leaders, but it couldn't stick together and eventually fell apart. The First International. And it was largely anarchists like Mikhail Bakunin and others who didn't get along with Marx, but it wasn't successful. Now, Marx was heavily involved in the struggle to defeat slavery in America. And I actually do want to recommend, I think I have a book here on my shelf I want to recommend. This book is fascinating. If I can just pull it up here, because there's a lot of history about Marx and America that we don't know about. And if I can, where is that book? Well, I don't have the book with me, but there's a very important book about the struggle against slavery in America. And it shows that there was a huge mass meeting in London during the U.S. Civil War called by the International Working Men's Association. The Marxists, Karl Marx and his activist buddies in London, organized a huge rally to support Abraham Lincoln and just to support the struggle to defeat slavery. It was a huge mass meeting, and U.S. President Abraham Lincoln actually sent a speech to be read on his behalf at that rally. So Karl Marx and Abraham Lincoln were quite close to one another. The fact that Lincoln, the president of the United States, sent a message to this mass anti-slavery rally that Karl Marx organized. That gets kind of looked over by American history, right? Because Abraham Lincoln is one of our most beloved presidents, and Karl Marx is considered, a communist. He's the bad guy. So we don't like to emphasize that in American history. But that there was this mass anti-slavery meeting that happened in London, organized by Karl Marx, and Abraham Lincoln sent a message to it. There was also a member of the International Working Men's Association, August Willich, who rose up to the rank of brigadier general in the Union Army. His name was August Willich, and he was a German guy who had fled Germany after the failure of the 1848 revolution, and he'd moved to Ohio, and he led the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. And there was a communist division of the U.S. military during the Civil War. It was called the Ohio 9th Infantry Regiment. Joseph Wademeyer led them, and August Willich ended up becoming a brigadier general in the Union Army. This is important history that people are not aware of. And the International Working Men's Association was an attempt to build an international communist group, and it was not successful. However, in the final years of Marx's life in Germany, they started moving toward forming a mass socialist party, the German Social Democratic Workers' Party. And they had a meeting in Gotha to form the party, and they wrote a manifesto, a statement of principles, the program of their party, the Gotha program. And Marx read it, and he said, "This is all wrong. It's completely wrong." And so he wrote a very, very important, one of Marx's most important pamphlets, which is called The Critique of the Gotha Program. And it's him going over the founding document of the German Social Democratic Party. It was then called the German Social Democratic Workers' Party, going over it point by point and saying that they have it wrong. And I would actually encourage people to read Critique of the Gotha Program if you can get your hands on it, because it says a lot of things. First of all, it points out that the only way that one could build a society with no classes, a society of total equality, would be to have vast abundance. And I always quote a paragraph from it that gets often overlooked, where he says the only way we'll ever create a stateless world is with vast material abundance. Let me put it on the screen. He says, in the higher phase of communist society, after the enslaving subordination of the individual to the division of labor, and therewith the antithesis between mental and physical labor has vanished, after labor has become not only a means of life, but life's prime want, after the productive forces have also increased with the all-around development of the individual, and the springs of cooperative wealth flow more abundantly, only then can the narrow horizon of bourgeois right be crossed in its entirety, and society inscribe on its banners, from each according to his own ability, to each according to his needs. So Marx is basically saying the only way we're going to get equality, you can't get equality with willpower. You can only create equality by creating abundance. And that the point of what he's struggling for is to liberate the means of production from the problem of overproduction, from the irrationality of production organized for profit. And by doing so, you can then lay the basis for a huge amount of abundance to come into existence. That's what he's arguing. And he argues against the redistribution of income. He says we're not interested in redistributing income. We want to change property relations. It's very, very important if you read Critique of the Gotha Program, because people have this caricature in their head of what they think socialism is, right? Mamdani is the biggest example of this. This New York City, the guy who's running for mayor of New York City on a socialist platform. It's all just redistribution of income. Well, Marx says we're not fighting for redistribution of income. We want to change property relations. On top of that, Marx wants to create so much wealth that the very need for the state will fade away. Well, Mamdani says wealth is bad, and that there's just too much wealth in this world, and we want to stop having so much wealth because it's bad for Mother Nature or something. That has nothing to do with what Marx wrote, right? Nothing to do with what Marx wrote about. And so he writes the Critique of the Gotha Program. Well, Marx died, but Friedrich Engels was involved in helping establish the German Social Democratic Workers' Party. And in Germany in particular, social democracy, which was the Marxist movement, became very, very popular. And for a while, they tried to outlaw it, actually. They had the anti-socialist laws that they passed in Germany, made it illegal to preach socialism. But it didn't make a difference. Socialism just became more and more popular. And as it got up into the 1890s, in Germany, millions and millions of people were Marxists. Marxism became probably the biggest political movement that Germany had ever seen at that point. The German Social Democratic Party, which still exists, by the way, it's one of the major political parties in Germany, the SPD, it became a mass movement. And it was the political movement of the labor unions. Labor unions were coming to existence. Germany was emerging to be an industrial country with steel mills and factories. And as the workers formed unions, the political party that was aligned with those unions was called the Social Democratic Party. And the ideology of the political party was Marxism. And Karl Kautsky was the leader of the German Social Democratic Party. Karl Kautsky was their big intellectual, their big ideological leader, their big thinker, Karl Kautsky. And he drew heavily from Marx and Engels. And the German Social Democratic Party was a mass party with millions and millions of people in it. And there were other parties. The British Labour Party came into existence as a Marxist party. And French socialist parties, French social democratic parties in Italy, in Austria, you had a big social democratic party. Marxism was a widespread movement. And Germany, it came into existence, and it's been pointed out that part of the reason that Marxism was so popular in Germany was because Germany was so late in the game in becoming a modern nation state, right? What year did Germany come into existence? It was like the 1860s, right? You know, when was the German nation state founded, right? It was like when? 1866. It was 1871. You finally had Germany. So Germany came into existence very late as a nation. And there had been so many revolutionary upsurges and all of that had created the space for like a mass revolutionary movement to come into existence, right? And that the German capitalists that were emerging to lead the modern German nation state were very weak. They were very weak, and they very much had relied on a mass leftist movement to exist, to overturn feudalism. And so that created the space for there to be a mass social democratic or Marxist movement in Germany. And in the 1890s, we know what was happening, which was that capitalism in the Western world was moving toward the stage of imperialism. And what's interesting is that social democracy in Germany and in other countries, but especially in Germany, where social democracy was very, very strong. I mean, the German Social Democratic Party was the biggest political party in the world at that point. I mean, it was a huge political movement, and it was the strongest in Germany. Nowhere was Marxism stronger than it was in Germany. And as Germany was becoming an imperialist country, social democracy, the reforms that the Social Democrats and the Marxists were fighting for, helped Germany to become an imperialist country. And this is something that many leftists don't understand. This is something that many Germans would get very upset if you brought it up. And this is just a historical reality that Lenin talked about that came to understand. But you know, Germany was the up and coming imperialist power, right? In the movie Reds, Warren Beatty, he explains World War I. He says, Britain and America and France run the world, and Austria and Germany just want a piece of it. And that was really the case, right? America, Britain, and France were the leading imperialist countries that were dominating the world. But Germany, Austria, and Turkey were trying to become imperialists themselves. And it was an inter-imperialist rivalry. And Germany was an up-and-coming imperialist power with a much weaker capitalist class. And in Germany, you had a huge socialist movement. And that socialist movement was led by people who wanted to overthrow capitalism. Karl Kautsky, people who were inspired by Marx, millions of people in socialist marching bands and socialist choirs. But a lot of what the socialist movement in Germany demanded strengthened German imperialism. One thing, for example, was universal public education. Right? In America at this time, we didn't have universal public education. Right? You go back to America in 1880, 1890, you know, you would be lucky for your kids to have a school to go to, right? There was no guarantee. And a lot of kids just worked in factories. And a lot of kids just worked on a farm and never learned to read. We didn't have universal education in America. But in Germany, the socialist movement, the Social Democratic Party, organized protests and strikes and demanded the creation of a public school system, universal compulsory education, and to create universal literacy in the nation. That was something that the German socialists fought for. Well, the Kaiser, the German, military leader, saw that having schools where all the kids go was very, very good for creating a strong military. And in the schools that they created, children were trained to march in line and be good soldiers. And that, and eventually in the lead up to World War I, that's when we got universal public education in America. It wasn't until until the lead up to World War I, that American lawmakers said, look, the Germans are going to beat us because all of their kids go to kindergarten. They go to kindergarten, right? And in kindergarten, they learn to march in line and they learn to be good soldiers and militarily. We got to do that over here. So by fighting against capitalism, demanding that the government create a universal public education system, that was something very revolutionary. That was a concession won from the capitalist class. However, it led to German imperialism having much more effective military education and military recruiting. The other thing is that the German Social Democrats created the first national healthcare service, right? The National Healthcare Service. And again, they didn't have that. In America, you went to a doctor, right? We didn't even have health insurance back then. You paid out of pocket for medical service, right? That's where you hear about people taking a chicken to the doctor or whatever. You paid out of pocket for medical service in the United States at that time. And that was how it was in pretty much every country in the world. But in Germany, with the German military, they created a public healthcare system to go along with their public education system. And this was something that the communist socialist movement, the Social Democrats, demanded, but it strengthened German imperialism because it centralized their healthcare system. It was tied in with the German military. It made the population much more healthy. And that while the German Social Democratic Party was led by people who were fighting to overthrow capitalism in Germany, they won a huge amount of reforms that actually strengthened German imperialism. And the same thing happened in America. The same thing happened in Britain. The same thing happened in France. But it was particularly powerful in Germany because Germany had the largest Marxist and Socialist party. And the German imperialists were so weak in comparison to the American, French, and British imperialists that they created the most concessions. The biggest welfare state at that time was in Germany. And that welfare state was intrinsically tied up with the German military and with imperialism. And it was very much like, okay, we're going to redistribute some of the wealth of empire, and we're going to train soldiers to be good workers. We're going to give them health care. We're going to have schools that they can all go to. And that social democracy was supposed to overthrow capitalism in Germany. But really what it did was strengthen it. It strengthened it by making it work more efficiently. If it was just the German capitalists, they would have preferred to let the kids, not have any education. But the German socialists came along and forced them to set up an education system. And overall, that strengthened German imperialism. If it was just up to the German capitalists, they would have just let them all keep paying for healthcare. But the German social democratic movement forced them to create a national healthcare service. And that ended up strengthening German imperialism. And this was the contradiction of the Marxist movement. The Marxist movement largely strengthened what it opposed, right? They didn't overthrow capitalism. What they did is they forced capitalism to function in a more efficient manner, right? It's very weird, right? People compare Roosevelt in America to the dentist. Nobody likes the dentist, but nobody likes the dentist, but you need the dentist when your cavity is really, really bad, right? And that social democracy was supposed to be a movement to overthrow capitalism, but it very much became a mechanism for strengthening capitalism by forcing capitalists to do things they didn't want to do, right? And that's a very interesting contradiction. And at the same time that German imperialism is rising, the working class of Germany is becoming divided. And it's becoming divided between the skilled and higher paid workers and the unskilled workers at the assembly line. And this is happening all over the Western world, right? The skilled and the unskilled. In America, the American Federation of Labor, the AFL, would only organize skilled workers. A lot of times their unions were for white workers only. You had to speak English. You couldn't be born in another country. And on top of that, you had to do a skilled trade. You had to go through an apprenticeship, right? Whereas people who just worked on the assembly line, who didn't speak English, who were born in another country, who were not white, they couldn't join the AFL. And so they joined the IWW, the Industrial Workers of the World, which was a union for all workers. And there was a division. The working class was becoming stratified. And the Marxist parties were becoming dominated by the higher paid skilled workers who were getting a benefit from imperialism. And this affected their character, right? And so over the course of the 1890s and the early 1900s, you have what you call the crisis of Marxism, because Marxism was everywhere, especially in Germany, but there was no revolution. And in fact, things weren't playing out as Marx had predicted. Marx had said that what would happen as capitalism developed is you'd get more poverty among the working class and more economic instability. And actually what was happening was a lot of German workers were getting more privilege, and they were moving up, and they were getting more stability, and the capitalist system was becoming more stable because of the healthcare system, because of the kindergarten, and also, but it was mainly paid for by the fact that Germany was seizing chunks of Africa, and it's seizing parts of China, and seizing parts of the world, and using them to rake in super profits, right? Imperialism, capitalism in its monopolistic stage, relies on the creation of an aristocracy of labor in the homeland. And it uses the super profits to stabilize capitalism in the Western countries. Capitalism was moving into its imperialist stage, and this crisis of Marxism was spreading everywhere. And everyone was noticing this, that communism and Marxist ideas were everywhere. The social democratic parties were everywhere in Europe, and Germany, and most especially, were they the biggest, but you weren't seeing any revolution. There was no revolution. And the climax of this was World War I. World War I broke out, and Germany and Austria and Turkey went to war with France and Britain and America. America didn't come in until the very end. And World War I broke out. And World War I was a barbaric war, the kind of war humanity had never seen before. This was the first war in which airplanes and bombing was used. This war involved poison gas and chemical weapons being used, widespread use of machine guns. There had been machine guns in other wars, Gatling guns, etc., but this was the first war with widespread use of machine guns. And World War I was an episode of mass death on the scale that humanity had never seen. And the important thing to remember, and again, I've said this on many a stream, and people get very fired up when I point this out, but you know, this is not something I thought of myself. This is something Lenin said, this is many others. World War I would never have happened if it wasn't for the Marxist movement. If the German Social Democratic Party, that had millions of people, that had, so many people loyal to it, if they had said no to World War I, they could have stopped it. If the British Labour Party, that had millions of workers loyal to it, if they had said no to World War I, they could have stopped it. If the French socialist groups had said no to World War I, they could have stopped it, right? But they didn't. The socialist movement, the Marxist movement, cooperated with World War I. And that is why World War I happened. And that social democracy as a movement, Marxism as a movement, had gradually become part of Western imperialism. It was the labor union affiliate, the labor union wing of Western imperialism. And that's what Lenin spends a huge amount of his writing showing, that German imperialism needed the Social Democrats. British imperialism needed the Labour Party. French imperialism needed the socialists, right? And that social democracy, the Marxist movement, was an essential part of imperialism, right? People don't understand this history, but you had a mass social democratic movement, a mass workers movement in Germany, and that movement was led by sellouts, by traitors who marched the German workers off to World War I. And it wasn't just that they didn't stop the war, they were part of making it happen, right? They were part of mobilizing the working class to go die in this horrendous war in which 20 million people died. Let me see. I think I've got a quote I can put on the screen about that. Right? All right. Yeah, this is Lenin writing about this at the time. He says, neither we nor anyone else can calculate precisely what portion of the proletariat is following and will follow the social chauvinists and the opportunists. This will be revealed only by the struggle, but it will be definitely decided only by socialist revolution. And we know that the defenders of the fatherland in the imperialist war represent only a minority. And it is therefore our duty, if we wish to remain socialists, to go lower and deeper to the real masses. And this is the whole purport of the struggle against opportunism, by exposing the fact that the opportunists and social chauvinists are in reality betraying and selling the interests of the masses, and that they are defending the temporary privileges of a minority of the workers that are vehicles of bourgeois ideas and influences, that are really allies and agents of the bourgeoisie. We teach the masses to appreciate their true political interests, to fight for socialism and for the revolution through all the long and painful vicissitudes of imperialist war and imperialist armistices. So he's saying, look, we have to oppose the Social Democrats. Socialism, the Marxist movement has become, he says, the only Marxist line in the world labor movement is to explain to the masses the inevitability and necessity of breaking with opportunism, and to educate them for revolution by waging a relentless struggle against opportunism, and to utilize the experience of war to expose, not conceal, the utter vileness of national labor politics. That is from Lenin's very famous pamphlet called Imperialism and the Split in Socialism. And that text, he gives a definition of imperialism, and he says, look, the Marxist movement has largely become a tool of imperialism, and that the German Social Democratic Party is a prime example of that. And so what happened? World War I goes on. 20 million workers died in World War I. And the Social Democratic Party went along with it. Now, there was one very, very brave woman who refused to go along with it. And her name was Rosa Luxemburg. And Rosa Luxemburg, right, she was a German socialist. She was born in Poland. And she was a leader of the socialist movement. And she refused to support World War I. And she wrote a pamphlet calling out the German Social Democratic Party for their betrayal of the working class. And she couldn't put her name on it because if she had been caught writing it, she would have gone to jail. And they did eventually catch her for writing this pamphlet, and they did throw her in prison. And so it's called the Junius Pamphlet of Rosa Luxemburg. It's a very powerful piece of writing where she calls out the German Social Democratic Party and the German Marxist movement for leading the workers to war. And in that pamphlet, she says that World War I is the beginning of a process. This is really important. You want to talk about somebody who was way ahead of their time. This is 1914. Rosa Luxemburg writes in 1914 that World War I is the beginning of a new stage of imperialism. That what Lenin said about capitalism entering the imperialist stage, she says World War I is the very beginning of another stage that she calls barbarism, of the Western countries deteriorating from within, right? It's very, very powerful. You read it, and she says basically World War I is a sign that eventually the Western world is going to come apart because of the problem of overproduction, because the capitalist system is so irrational, because technology leads to economic crisis. The Western world is going to come apart internally, and it's going to have constant war. This is what she wrote. This world war is a regression into barbarism. The triumph of imperialism leads to the annihilation of civilization. At first, this happens sporadically for the duration of modern war. But then, when the period of unlimited wars begins, it progresses towards its inevitable consequence. The triumph of imperialism and the collapse of all civilization, as in ancient Rome. Depopulation, desolation, degeneration, a great cemetery. Now, that's Rosa Luxemburg, and she was well over 100 years ahead of our time, because now we live in the time when war is unlimited. But it wasn't unlimited, right? But World War I, there was World War I, and then you had a decade of peace, and then an economic crisis, and then World War II. But now, 100 years later, we're seeing this. The Western countries are deteriorating from within. They're falling apart. Look at the West. I mean, the West is in a state of internal collapse, right? Trump just sent the military to Chicago, right? We got the military on the streets of Portland. We got our roads and bridges falling apart, I mean, the West is in a state of complete and utter collapse. Right. And that this is a result of imperialism. This is the natural progression of imperialism. And that imperialism would eventually lead to civilization coming apart. This is a brilliant breakthrough that Rosa Luxemburg had. And that's Rosa Luxemburg. She predicted this at the beginning of World War I, and this was a pamphlet that she wrote that was illegal. It was called the Junius Pamphlet, and it was a brilliant piece of writing. And Lenin had never heard of Rosa Luxemburg, right? But he read this pamphlet. He got his hands on the Junius Pamphlet, and Lenin said, "This is some of the most brilliant writing I've ever read." Lenin had never heard of Rosa Luxemburg, but he read it and he loved it. And what happened? Well, Germany lost World War I. They lost. And, German imperialism collapsed at the end of World War I. And there was an armistice declared on the land. And then the Kaiser ordered the Navy to go and do a suicide mission, to just go do one last, go die, basically. And when that happened, when they were ordered to go die, they didn't do it. And they shot their officers. And I actually have a very, very good book on that. If I could just, where did I put it? It's called The Failure of a Revolution. I've got a copy of it somewhere, but The Failure of a Revolution, where the German military was made up of working class people, soldiers, and they refused to go die. And the German government collapsed at the end of World War I in a mass working class uprising. The German workers didn't want to die in the war, and they were told basically, you're going to have to go die. And so there was a mass working class uprising at the end of World War I, and the German government fell. And all over Germany, workers' councils, military councils were established, and the German government collapsed amid this gigantic uprising that took place, and workers' assemblies, workers' councils were created, and it was like they had a revolution. It's really the only time we've seen like a full revolution in a Western country. And so all big chunks of Germany are under the control of these labor union-led councils, these social democrats and others. So what happens? The German social democrats gathered in Weimar, Germany, and they wrote a capitalist constitution. And they declared that you couldn't establish a socialist government because that would be undemocratic. And Trotsky wrote a pamphlet condemning the Soviet Union. The Bolsheviks had taken power and created the Soviet Union. And Trotsky said, that's not democratic. It's not democratic. They didn't have a popular mandate for what they did. And they condemned it, and they wrote a capitalist constitution. They created the Weimar Republic. And David is always one step ahead of me. Bavaria, the region of Bavaria, declared independence from Germany, and they created the Bavarian Soviet Republic. And Bavaria became Red Bavaria. They called it Red Bavaria. And for like a year, you had a communist government in Bavaria. Now, it's funny. Bavaria is considered today to be a very, very conservative part of Germany. It's very Roman Catholic, and it's very, it's like they're almost like they consider them kind of the hillbillies of Germany. But Bavaria was Red Bavaria at the end of World War I, and they refused to accept the Weimar Constitution. And this woman, Rosa Luxemburg, she and her friend, I think it was her partner, I don't know if they were married or whatnot, but Rosa Luxemburg and Karl Liebknecht, they formed a group called the Spartacus Bund, or the Spartacus League, named after Spartacus, the leader of the slave revolt. And the ancient Roman slave revolutionary Spartacus, they formed the Spartacus League. And the Spartacus League rose up against the German German government, and they wanted to continue the revolution. And so the Social Democrats got a whole bunch of former soldiers called the Freikorps, and they crushed Rosa Luxemburg, and they killed her very brutally. They threw her body into a river, and she was killed, and very brutally murdered in, I believe, 1918 or 1919 at the end of World War I. Very horrendous. And so Germany had this revolutionary crisis at the end of World War I, and Rosa Luxemburg was killed. Red Bavaria was declared, and Red Bavaria, well, they didn't do too well because they were surrounded, because the rest of Germany was against them. They were basically waging a civil war against the rest of Germany, and there was a lot of chaos, and it was not a good time. It was not a good time. And it was kind of like what they're doing to Venezuela, kind of like what they do to socialist countries in general. They said, look how bad the socialists are at managing things. And it was, it was this temporarily established revolutionary government. There was chaos, there was instability, there was shortages of food and people fighting and armed battles. And they used Red Bavaria for, the next decade is look how bad Germany will be if the communists take over. They said, look, the communists, you had communism in Bavaria and they took it over and look what it was. And they also used the fact that one of the government officials in Bavaria, one of the Red Bavarian guys, had been in a mental hospital at one point. They said, oh, look, that's what the communists want to create. They want to put crazy people, crazy, people that belong in asylums in charge of the government. Red Bavaria was a very bad situation. People who lived there were not happy because they were fighting a civil war against the rest of Germany, because food was not being delivered, because there was violence and chaos. And so, after Red Bavaria fell and rejoined the rest of Germany, they used that as like the negative example for a long time. That was a big talking point of anti-communism. And the Weimar Republic came into being. And after World War I, the Weimar Republic came into being. Now, Germany was very much humiliated at the end of World War I. They lost huge amounts of territory, and the German people had to pay a huge amount of taxes to France and Britain as reparations. The idea was that Germany was responsible for the war. So average working people went to work and a chunk of their paycheck got sent to Britain and France as reparations for the war. And that was the Versailles Treaty. And it was very degrading and humiliating. And Germany was not allowed to have a military. And Germany was subjected to a kind of national humiliation. The mainstream political parties in Germany supported the Versailles Treaty. They said, we were wrong. World War I was not a good war. We shouldn't have fought it. However, the Communist Party opposed it because they said it wasn't the German working class that created World War I. It was the imperialists. And so why should workers have to pay for it? And the far right, like the nationalists, they opposed it because they said they were right. Germany did nothing wrong in World War I, and why should they admit guilt? But the Social Democratic Party, they supported paying reparations, and they supported the Versailles Treaty. And the mainstream political parties, the Christian Democratic Party, they supported the Versailles Treaty. And the Treaty of Versailles was national humiliation. Plus, Germany had to borrow a lot of money from American and British banks to rebuild itself. And there was a huge amount of poverty in Germany after World War I. And there had also, the Social Democratic Party was a major political party that was, the biggest political party that had created the Weimar Republic. But the Social Democratic Party had murdered Rosa Luxemburg and killed Rosa Luxemburg. And so there was a river of blood between the Social Democratic Party, the party of German imperialism, the party that supported the Versailles Treaty, and the communists. And there was a communist party that was formed in Germany. And the Communist Party was people that admired Rosa Luxemburg and people that took direction from the Soviet Union. And the leader of the German Communist Party was a guy named Ernst Thälmann. And this guy, I have actually spent a long time studying. He's actually one of my, at one point I was very fascinated and obsessed with Ernst Thälmann. When I was on the ship going to Yemen, I had in my bag a biography of Ernst Thälmann, the leader of the German Communist Party in the 1920s and 30s. And Ernst Thälmann, I'm going to put a picture of him on the screen. Ernst Thälmann, he was Mr. Communism, right? The policy of the communist parties, following the Soviet Union, they had a figure that was like their leader, that they built up kind of worship for. And, kind of like, in the Soviet Union, they built up Lenin, the cult of Lenin. They put Lenin in the mausoleum. They worshiped Lenin. And then Stalin was the great leader. Ernst Thälmann was the leader of German communism in the 1920s and the 1930s. And he was just the icon of the German communist movement. He was a dock worker, and he was quite conservative. So much so that he would not allow men to dance with his sisters at bars, unless they asked his permission first. When he would go to bars, his sisters would be at the bar, and if a guy asked one of his sisters to dance, without talking to him first, he would beat them up. He would punch them, right? Now, that's obviously very, very traditional and very, very patriarchal. But that was Ernst Thälmann was very, very much a conservative. It's very interesting because he was a communist, but he had this very traditional German way of doing things. He was also very, very masculine. For example, you see him there in this picture wearing a tie, right? And it was his tradition. I find this amazing that, he was a working class guy, but as a politician, he was expected to wear a tie. And he was a member of the parliament, and it was required that you wear a tie on the floor of the parliament. So when he would get up in front of a crowd to give a speech at a rally, he would rip his tie off and the crowd would applaud. That was his trademark for how he started a speech. He would walk up to the podium and then he would take his tie off to show he was one of the workers, and everyone would applaud. Yay, he's taking his tie off. He's one of us. He's one of us. Right? Very fascinating. That was kind of his trademark, as he took his tie off. That was his one of his theatrical tactics that he used at his rallies, right? And Ernst Thälmann was a very good speaker, and he was a dock worker. He was a big, strong, built guy who carried boxes around, unloaded ships for a living. And he was the face of German communism, Ernst Thälmann. And he absolutely hated the Social Democratic Party because they'd murdered Rosa Luxemburg and they had started World War I. And Ernst Thälmann, as the face of German communism very much pivoted into being what you might call an ultra-left political party. Now, there's a lot of bullshit written about Germany and the rise of Hitler. Okay, and the reason I'm talking about this tonight is because there's all this talk about fascism and there's all this stuff out there, and we need to be very clear, because this is one of the main talking points of Trotskyites and others, is they say it's his fault, it's Ernst Thälmann's fault that Hitler came to power. That is not the truth. One of their talking points is they say, well, if only the German Social Democrats and the German communists had gotten together, they could have blocked Hitler. That is true, except that never would have happened. That never would have happened because they hated each other, because the German Social Democrats had killed Rosa Luxemburg, and the German communists and the German Social Democrats, their policies became opposite. The German Social Democrats became more and more reformist, and the German communists became more and more radical and ultra-left. And that was because they represented different demographics. The German Social Democrats represented workers who were working in factories and were members of labor unions. And when the Great Depression hit, but even before that, in the 1920s, when Germany was having all its problems, if you had a job in a factory and you were represented by a labor union, you were damn lucky. And you didn't want to rock the boat, right? Because you could lose your job. There was mass unemployment in Germany. So the Social Democratic Party became more and more reformist, toning it down, representing the factory workers, the people that were lucky enough to still have a union job in a factory. Whereas the Communist Party became the party of desperately poor, unemployed people who had nothing to lose, and were willing to go out and fight. And so the desperately poor, unemployed people that are often just turning to crime to survive, lumpen elements, the German Communist Party basically became a party of the lumpen proletariat, of the desperately poor, whereas the German Social Democratic Party became the party of the labor aristocracy and the reformist and most privileged people in the working class. Their politics were like miles and miles apart. And the German Communist Party was very much the party of desperately poor people in Germany who could barely survive, who had to go out and fight for their basic survival. And they built unemployed associations, and they conducted what they called bread riots, where they broke into stores and took food, right? And they had their own militia, their own private army. It was called the Red Front Fighters League. And there's, I'm going to show you, this is from the movie they made about the life of Ernst Thälmann in Germany. And this shows you what it was like. This was what a typical day was like in the day of the time of the 1920s in Germany, when the German Communist Party led mobs of desperately poor, hungry people in Germany. Yeah, and it was, they waged the bread riots, and they were the party of desperately poor people, and they had what they called the Red Front Fighters League, which was their own private army that trained people in how to use guns, and they went around, basically taking mobs of desperately poor people and breaking store windows to feed the poor, and and exercising power, and that there was an element of, they were almost kind of like a gang, right? And that there were a lot of criminal elements that did get involved with them. They made alliances with organized crime, gangsters, mafia kind of people. And they were this mass movement of desperately poor people that was organized, and they took direction from the Soviet Union. And they wanted to create a Soviet Germany. That's what they were fighting for. There's a song that was created for this period. And it's called the United Front Song. And I want to play, this is a recording of the United Front Song. This is in English. This is the song that they sang. It was written by Bert Brecht, who was like a famous playwright. He wrote Three Penny Opera, but he was a communist, and he wrote a lot of their songs. And this is the song when they were organizing the desperately poor people, the United Front. This is the United Front Song. Here we go.
And just because he's human, a man would like a little bite to eat. He won't get full on a lot of talk that would give him bread and meat. So left, 2, 3, so left, 2, 3, to the work that we must do. March on in the Workers' United Front, for you are a worker too. And just because he's human, he doesn't like a pistol to his head. He wants no servants under him and no boss overhead. So left, 2, 3, so left, 2, 3, to the work that we must do. March on in the Workers' United Front, for you are a worker too. And just because he's a worker, the job is all his own. The liberation of the working class is the work of the workers alone. So left, 2, 3, so left, 2, 3, to the work that we must do. March on in the Workers' United Front, for you are a worker too.
Yeah. March on in the Workers' United Front, for you are a worker too. And it was this mass party. It was the largest communist party in the world outside of the Soviet Union. And they were a party of many, many, many millions of hungry, poor people. And they had lots of seats in the German parliament, and they were very popular. And in 1929, they basically decided to show their strength. 1929, they announced that they were going to have an armed parade on May 1st. They were going to march through the streets of Berlin with firearms on May 1st. And the German government said, you can't do that. We don't allow armed parades. And they said, we're going to do it anyway. And so they showed up and they had their militia march through the streets of the Wedding district in Berlin with guns. And the police, most of whom were Social Democrats, opened fire on them. Now, it's not clear who fired the first shot or what exactly happened, but they were all ready. The communists had prepared this. It was almost staged, right? And they seized Wedding. They seized the Berlin district. It was like a revolution that was planned. And the Communist Party seized control of a big chunk of Berlin. And for like 3 weeks, there were armed battles between the army and the police and the communist militia to try and seize control of the Wedding district. And that was a big event. A lot of people died, and it was very chaotic. The other thing that was happening was that there were all these other groups that had been formed, right, to fight the communists. You had the general German government, right? And then you had these various right-wing groups that were formed of former military officers that were against the communists, right? And they were called the Freikorps, or the Free Officers. And there were a lot of them, and they were German nationalists that thought communism was a foreign conspiracy and would hurt the German nation. And Nazism started out as one of these groups, and eventually those groups started merging into the Nazi Party. But it's now proven those groups were being funded by the British, because the British were very afraid of Germany and Russia together, right? If Germany and Russia were to align with each other, then the British Empire would lose control of the European mainland. And that was a really big fear. And so the British were giving guns and weapons to various Freikorps, right-wing anti-communist groups. And the Communist Party of Germany, the Red Front Fighters League, and the Nazis and these other right-wing groups that eventually merged into the Nazis, they would fight each other in the streets. And the Social Democrats had their own militia, and they fought against the communists as well. And there were a lot of these various like armed groups in the streets of Germany that were fighting against other armed groups, right? You had the government, you had the actual German government, but it was these kind of paramilitary organizations. What we now use the term non-state actors. Non-state actors started to control things. Some neighborhoods were controlled by far right-wing groups. Some neighborhoods were controlled by Social Democrats. Some neighborhoods were controlled by communists. Okay. Various political parties started to have their own army and their own militias. And depending on where you were, that kind of determined what political party ran your district. People say it's actually very similar to how Hezbollah kind of operates in Lebanon, right? Hezbollah is not the military of Lebanon, but they have their own army. And in certain parts of Lebanon, they are the government. They're like a government within a government. And that's what the German communists were. And that's what the Nazis were. And that's what the Social Democrats were. It was like you had various different political parties and movements that had influence. Now, I want to talk about, there's this term that gets used, Nazbol. What is a Nazbol? All right, well, it means National Bolshevik. In Russia in the 90s, there was a party called the National Bolshevik Party. Where did they get their name? This is very interesting. Where did they get their name? Well, in Germany, there was a group of German communists within the German Communist Party who had a different strategy. And this is very interesting. They had a different strategy. So the main line of the German Communist Party was the class line, workers against the bosses, right? And that the Communist Party was fighting for a workers' united front, dictatorship of the proletariat. The communists were against the Versailles Treaty because why should the workers have to pay for a war the capitalists caused? But the German communists were opposed to German nationalism because they said Germany is an imperialist country, right? And so they weren't in favor of being proud to be German. They weren't, ultra patriotic to Germany. Instead, their line was, we're for the working class. The workers have no country. We want to bond with the workers of France. We want to bond with the workers of Britain, right? That was their notion, right? Well, the National Bolsheviks were a faction within the German Communist Party that said, look, Germany has been stripped of its colonies. And so Germany is no longer an imperialist country because it doesn't have any colonies. And it lost World War I. It no longer has a military. And now the German working class is oppressed, but so are the German capitalists. right? That we're now an oppressed nation. We've been colonized by the British and the Americans and the French. We've been colonized. And because we've been colonized, the Communist Party should lead a fight for national liberation. We should view Germany the same way you might view China or an African country or a country in South America. That the communists should, instead of trying to build a class war in Germany, if the workers fight the capitalists, the communists should lead a national liberation movement. That's what the National Bolsheviks said. They said that basically Germany has been reduced to being a colony of the British and Americans, and so we're going to lead a national liberation movement. Well, they were repudiated. Stalin didn't agree with them. The German Communist Party rejected their idea. The National Bolshevik Party, it was founded by Alexander Dugin in Russia. They argued that the National Bolsheviks were correct. Now, I don't know what that has to do with Russia in the 90s, right? Russia is in a completely different situation. But I think that the National Bolshevik position in Germany made sense, because the reason that the Nazis were ultimately able to prevail was because of the fact that the German people largely felt humiliated as Germans for World War I, right? That they felt that they were suffering because they were German. The communists appealed to people on a class basis. You're suffering because you're a worker. It's the worker against the capitalists. But most Germans felt we are being humiliated because we are German. And the communists had no answer for that. Even though they opposed the Versailles Treaty, the feeling on the streets of Germany is that Germans have been forced to suffer because we are German. And the communists, as popular as they still were opposed to any German nationalism, even though Germany didn't have any colonies. And so what happened? Well, after 1929, after the communist uprising in 1929, after that, it became clear that that there was a real possibility of a communist revolution in Germany. So the Nazi Party, that had previously been a street fighting organization funded by the British, entered an alliance with Hjalmar Schacht, right? Hjalmar Schacht was the German economist. And he was a German banker who was anti-British and was a friend of the Krupps and the Tysons and a number of German industrialists who were anti-British and anti-communist. And the anti-communist street fighting group, the Nazis, were recruited, and they transformed themselves into a party that could actually win elections. And there was a big fight within the Nazi Party between Hitler, who was their main leader, and Gregor Strasser. Gregor Strasser was the main rival of Hitler's, and Gregor Strasser wanted to maintain a street fighting organization, and he believed in the socialism part of National Socialism. He believed that he was against Marxism and he was against the Soviet Union, but he also wanted to overthrow capitalism, etc. He had an anti-capitalist line. And Hitler and Gregor Strasser had a big argument where Hitler said that National Socialism just means it means that corporations have to be patriotic. They have to be loyal to the nation. Whereas Gregor Strasser said, no, we need National Socialism as an alternative to international communism. And Gregor Strasser lost and Hitler won. And the Nazi Party pivoted toward being much more pro-free market and much more capitalist, and kind of losing the economic populism that had accompanied a lot of their nationalism and anti-communism before. The Nazi Party was based on anti-Semitism, and they believed Marxism was a Jewish conspiracy. However, what they wanted to do and to oppose Marxism was not clear. And Gregor Strasser and his faction, they wanted some kind of nationalistic, German nationalistic planned economy. Whereas Hitler said, I just want to have a really, really strong, powerful government that will allow the market to continue, but will, build up Germany to be a powerful country again. And that was the fight. And Hitler won. And the Nazi Party transitioned from being a party of street fighting thugs to being a party of politicians. They were moving toward taking power, which is a very, very important distinction, right? And the Nazi Party stopped just being a street fighting party and started becoming a serious political party. And as they did that, there were other events that were taking place, right? So Germany is impoverished because it has to pay back all these loans to American and British banks, and the entire Western economy crashes 1929. Right? The stock market crashes in America. The whole world is having an economic crisis. And Germany's economic pain gets more and more worse and more painful. And the Nazis start moving toward taking power, right? And, there was an election. The Nazis did not get a majority. The communists and the social democrats and the other parties, they didn't have a majority. But then the conservative party made an alliance with the Nazi party. They named Hitler the chancellor of the country. Then what happened was somebody burned the Reichstag, the German parliament building, kind of the equivalent of the U.S. Capitol building in the United States. The German parliament was lit on fire. And they arrested a guy for doing it who was a mentally ill man who, I guess, called himself a communist. And they said that the Communist Party had been responsible for burning the Reichstag. Now, it's never been proven that the Communist Party had anything to do with it. But they blamed the Communist Party for burning the Reichstag. So the leaders of the Communist Party that were members of the parliament, they were arrested. And so they lost their seats in the parliament, and the Nazis took their seats. And so then the Nazis had a majority in the parliament, and they were able to establish a government. And Hitler declared a state of emergency. And that's how the Nazi party became the ruling party of Germany. It was first there was an alliance, then the Reichstag got burned, and then they declared a state of emergency, and that's how the Nazis came to power. So Jordan Peterson has said on his videos, the Nazis had a huge majority. They had a huge majority. That's not true. The Nazis never won a majority. They never won a majority in the parliament. They never did. The communists got more votes than the Nazis very consistently. The Nazis were always a minority party. They just won through a series of electoral maneuvers where basically the other capitalist parties handed them power. And the Nazis came to power. And many people ask the question, and this is a common thing. So first of all, the first talking point is the German communists and social democrats should have teamed up to fight Hitler. That wasn't going to happen. That was never going to happen. They hated each other. They'd killed each other in the streets. They represented two very distinct groups of people that are well-paid, very privileged workers, and very desperately poor, starving, poor people that are forming armed militias. They're not going to see eye to eye. That wasn't going to happen. So that first talking point is bullshit. Second talking point is people say, well, why wasn't there an armed uprising as soon as Hitler came to power? Because they would have lost. They would have lost if they did that. They would have lost. And the communists immediately set up an underground network within Germany. There were millions of Germans that were communists, that when the Communist Party was outlawed and when it became a one-party state, the Nazi Party took over, they said, sorry, and they were still going to secret communist meetings, and they were still smuggling information to the Soviet Union. There was a huge network of underground communist groups inside of Germany throughout the entire existence of the Nazi Party. And people don't understand that. And if they had launched an armed uprising in 1933, as soon as the Nazis took over, that whole network would have been destroyed. And it's a good thing they didn't do that. But that's another thing people say, why didn't they? They had guns, they had their militias. Why didn't they just rise up? Because they would have lost that underground network. And throughout the entire 1930s, the Communist Party existed as an underground faction. Now, the leaders of the Communist Party and the leaders of the Social Democratic Party were all put in concentration camps. And that was the way the Nazis were able to establish an economic boom is that, first of all, they rounded up all the leaders of the Social Democratic Party and all the leaders of the Communist Party, hundreds of thousands of people, and put them in concentration camps as prisoners. They then pushed women out of the workforce. They made it so women could not, they basically shamed women out of having jobs in factories. They then restarted military spending and started re-spending lots of money on building guns and tanks and weapons, which they had not been allowed to do. They stopped paying back American and British banks. And there's a story of Hjalmar Schacht, who was the banker who really brought Hitler to power. Hjalmar Schacht met with Roosevelt And he told Roosevelt, we're not going to pay back any of our loans. American banks have loaned Germany all this money. We're not paying them back. And Roosevelt laughed. He laughed and he said, serves those Wall Street guys right. And he laughed about it because Roosevelt could tell that Germany had been mistreated. And so because of that, they stopped paying back American and British banks. They restarted military spending. They pushed women out of the workforce. They built all these concentration camps. So all these people weren't out looking for jobs. They were in concentration camps. On top of that, they had to hire people to be guards in the concentration camps, had to hire people to build the concentration camps. And these concentration camps did free labor, right, for corporations. On top of that, they built these highways across Germany called the Autobahns. And in 1934-35, they had an economic boom in Germany. They eradicated unemployment. And that's what Hitler promised to do. People don't remember this. People think Hitler took power saying, I'm going to come into power and eradicate the Jews. That's not what he said. He said, I'm going to eradicate unemployment. And he did, right? And they had an economic boom because they restarted military spending. They created a slave labor underclass. They removed women from the workforce, and they started militarizing the economy. So Hitler did create an economic boom temporarily. And this is one thing that drives me crazy, because no one ever acknowledges that the Soviet Union had any economic successes. But people always say, oh, wow, Hitler fixed the economy. Well, he did fix the economy, but only temporarily. By 1939, the German economy was collapsing again, right? And people don't acknowledge that. And he fixed it with degrowth methods. And so one of the things they did is they rounded up all these communists, right? And they put them in prison camps where they forced them to do slave labor. And one of the things they did was they peat moss, right, is used in agriculture, and the peat bogs, it comes from bogs. That's where you get peat moss. They had them working in bogs, to create peat moss. And so this song became a very famous song among communists around the world. It was a song of the peat bog soldiers, of the communists who were forced to work as slave laborers in the bogs, right? This is the song, the peat bog soldiers, right? Because all these communists were forced to be, prison laborers, basically. And they would carry shovels, right? And they would work in the bogs. So this is the famous song called the Peat Bog Soldiers, right? It was in German originally. They translated it into English, but it was a song of the German communist prisoners in the concentration camps, working in the bogs, digging peat moss out of the bogs.
As the eye can wander, heath and bog are everywhere. Not a bird sings out to cheer us. Oaks are standing gaunt and bare. We are the peat bog soldiers. We're marching with our spades to the moor. We are the peat bog soldiers. We're marching with our spades to the moor. Up and down the guards are pacing. No one can get through. Flight would mean a sure death facing. Guns and barbed wire block our view. We are the peat bog soldiers. We're marching with our spades to the moor. We are the peat bog soldiers. We're marching with our spades to the moor. But for us there is no complaining. Winter will in time be past. One day we shall rise rejoicing. Homeland dear, you're mine at last. Then will the peat bog soldiers soldiers march no more with their spades to the moor. Then will the Peterborough soldiers march no more with their spades to the moor. Wohin auf das Auge blicket, Mord und Heiden und Sohn, Vogelsang und Schnitter quicket, Eichen stehen kahl und krumm. Wir sind die Mordsoldaten und sehen mit den Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Mordsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Hier in dieser öden Heide ist das Lager aufgebaut, wo wir von jeder Freude in der starke Draht verstaut. Wir sind die Mordsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Mordsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Morgen sehen die Kolonien in das Moor zur arbeiten, graben bei dem Brand der Sonne, doch zur Heimat steht der See. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Auf und nieder gehen die Posten, keiner kann hindurch. Blut wird nur das Leben kosten, wer vergisst umsäumt die Bursch. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Wir sind die Moorsoldaten und ziehen mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Doch vor uns gibt es kein Klagen, ewig kann nicht Winter sein. Einmal werden froh wir sagen, Heimat, du bist wieder mein. Dann sind die Moorsoldaten nicht mehr mit dem Spaten ins Moor. Dann sind die Moorsoldaten nicht mehr mit dem Spaten ins Moor.
Yeah, and you notice that song actually, despite being about such a sad topic, right? It ends on a very positive note, right? But for us there is no complaining. Winter shall in time be past. One day we'll arise rejoicing. Homeland lad, you're mine at last, right? You know, it actually ends on a positive note. Now, I'll tell you one thing. I did not hear that song for years. And these German communist songs, like the one that I just played, the United Front song, and then that one, just Pete Bog Soldiers, that one, and one that I'm going to play later. These were really the songs of the Communist Party, right? The Communist Party USA sang all these songs because the German Communist Party was the largest political party of the largest communist party outside the Soviet Union. And so, especially as anti-fascism became the focus of the Communist Party in the late 1930s, these songs became songs, but you don't hear them generally. Folk singers in the 60s didn't sing these songs. I mean, that song you might have heard once or twice, but these kind of songs kind of got overlooked because they were Stalinist songs. These were Marxist, Leninist, Stalinist songs. They were not, people sing the Joe Hill songs and they sing the We Shall Overcome and stuff like that. But these songs, they had a particular militaristic tone to them, right? And they were from the era of Stalin. They were from the era of World War II. They were particularly, this is a big theme in CPI that I've been, just hammering home about how there was a spiritual change in communism, especially in the late 1930s. And I'll talk probably more about that later. I end up talking about it on every stream, and right, it's a big point of the innovationist turn. But there was kind of a spiritual shift, and these songs, they don't sound like your typical wobbly IWW leftist song. There's something kind of different going on. So anyway, a big event. So after the Nazis came to power, after the Communist Party is outlawed, they grabbed this guy, right? And this guy is a really big deal in international communism. This guy was living in Germany, but he wasn't a German. He was a Bulgarian guy. They arrested him. He was a Bulgarian guy who was living in Germany. And they charged him with having conspired with the other German communists to burn the Reichstag. He was a Bulgarian guy who'd fled from Bulgaria, was a communist. He was in the German Communist Party. The German government arrested him, and they made him like the poster boy. This guy was the leader of the conspiracy to burn the Reichstag. His name was Georgy Dimitrov. Now, he didn't do it. And they gave him a show trial that was on the radio. And even though German was not his native language, he made a fool out of Goering at his trial. He had the ability to be interrogated and to testify. And he proved on the witness stand that he didn't do it. And so the German government had no choice but to free him. And he then got to go to the Soviet Union, and he was welcomed to the Soviet Union as a hero because this guy had been a leader of German communism, and the German government had tried to pin burning the Reichstag on this guy. And even though it was a kangaroo court, and even though it was a show trial, he was able to just show that he didn't do it. And they sent him back to the Soviet Union. And he became like a hero of the international communist movement. And it was him in 1935 who gave the very famous speech. The Seventh World Congress of the Communist International happened in 1935. And at the Seventh World Congress, the communists changed their tactic. Instead of opposing the Social Democrats, they started forming an anti-fascist united front, right? In the 1930s, there were two distinct periods, right? And this is important history. 1928, you had the Sixth World Congress. And that was the World Congress, the victory over Trotskyism. That's when Stalin became the leader of the international communist movement. And the position became class against class. And it was the third period. They argued that there had been the period of uprisings after World War I, the first period. Then there had been the period of capitalist stabilization, the Roaring 20s. But now, with the Great Depression coming on, they'd entered the third period, which would be the period of social revolution and the period of victorious socialist construction. And during the third period, the Social Democrats were the main enemy. And it was the duty of the communists to oppose the Social Democrats, and that the Social Democrats were the main threat, and that industrial capitalists, and this is not emphasized, but captains of industry, industrialists, could be allies of the Soviet Union. Henry Ford went to the Soviet Union, and Stalin welcomed him and Henry Ford helped them set up a car industry in the Soviet Union. And the Koch brothers, Fred Koch, their father, went to the Soviet Union and helped them set up the oil industry. General Electric went to the Soviet Union and helped them set up their power plants. And that Stalin took the position that the main threat was the bankers, the Eastern establishment, the liberals were the main threat because they wanted to hold off revolution and they were promoting social democracy. But the industrialists, the factory owners, could be allies of the Soviet Union because they wanted economic growth. And so while Stalin was kind of befriending the industrialists, the communists went around fighting the Social Democrats, building armies of desperately poor people, lumpen people to fight the Social Democrats. Well, then when Hitler came to power, after Hitler came to power in 1935, you had the Seventh World Congress. And the Seventh World Congress is where Georgy Dimitrov, welcomed back to the Soviet Union as a hero, announced that they were shifting again. They were going to align with the Social Democrats, align with the liberals against fascism. And a lot of these industrialists were supporting fascism because fascism would crush the labor unions. They thought labor unions were communist. Fascism would crush the labor unions. Henry Ford, all of them, these industrialists that that Stalin had been friendly with, they were now supporting fascism. So now it was important to align with the liberals and Social Democrats against the Social Democrats. And this is an important thing to remember. Communism has no loyalty to the left. Let me repeat that. Communism, socialism, anti-imperialism has no loyalty to the left. During the 1930s, the early 1930s, after the Sixth World Congress, the feeling was that Social Democrats and the left were the main danger. And then the right wing became the main danger. It's based on the balance of forces at the time. That's what it's based on. There is no principle that says the left is always better than the right. At one point in the 1930s, it was correct to fight the left. And then later it became correct to align with the left against the right. It depends. And this is something that people have forgotten. They've completely forgotten this. But there is absolutely no principle that says the left is always better than the right. And in the early 1930s, the right was clearly better than the left, and the left was the main danger. And then that changed once fascism came in. That's important. So Georgy Dimitrov was released. However, Ernst Thälmann was still in prison as the leader of the German Communist Party. He became, kind of the symbol of the oppressed German communists. There were thousands and thousands of communists in the concentration camp system. And Thälmann was not released. Now, most of the German communists, they put them in the prison camp for 1 or 2 years, and then they let them out, right? Right. That was generally how it was done, right? That to solidify the power of the Nazi state, they put all the opposition leaders in prison camps for 1 or 2 years, and then they let them out. And they used the camp system to terrorize people, right? People didn't question the government. People didn't oppose things because they were afraid of being taken to the prison camps. But they let most of the people out after 2 years. If it was understood that they wouldn't be a threat to national security, it was understood they were no longer loyal to the communists, they let them out. They didn't let Ernst Thälmann out, but they let most people out. But then the prison camp system was there as like a threat. It was like hanging over your head if you were speaking out against the government, or you were seen as being against Nazism or whatever, that you might end up at one. And there's, very sad stories of, Germany had been a very open, free society. Germany, they'd had gay bars, and, that Germany had been a very liberal place, but then it became this very, very authoritarian place. And that, they tell, it was very tragic. There were jokes among the population, right? There was a joke about, one guy, he's in a bar and he sees a friend of his, and he hasn't seen this friend in a few years, and he goes over to the friend and he says, "Wow, it's so good to see you. Last I heard, they took you to a concentration camp, and you were in a labor camp, and now you're out of the labor camp, and it's so great to see you. What was it like?" And the guy says, "Oh, it was absolutely amazing being in the labor camp. Utterly amazing. I got to exercise and work out, and I got to sleep on the beach, and it was like a vacation. It was just utterly amazing. I just loved being in the labor camp." And the guy says, "That's weird. That's weird." He says, "My other friend who was in the labor camp, in the concentration camp, he said it was horrible, and they barely got any food, and they had to work all day long. And if you tried to leave, they shot you in the back as you ran away. And it was really horrible." And then the guy laughed and he said, "Well, clearly that guy was lying. He liked it so much he went back." Now that was the kind of humor that people had. That's a very dark joke. That's a very, very, very dark joke. But that's kind of the atmosphere. Everyone was very terrified that if you said something against the Nazis, you would end up in a camp. And that was kind of the atmosphere. And that, people were very, very terrified in the country. And that, you know, they let people out. They didn't let Ernst Thälmann out, and he became kind of the symbol of communists, in the jail, right? And there was a global campaign to free Ernst Thälmann. He was like the hero from the jail cell, and like his daughters and his wife would visit him and like hand him notes and stuff like that. And so while Ernst Thälmann was in the jail cell, Germans who had fled from Germany went to Spain to fight against fascism. So in Spain, you had the Spanish Republic, the elected government, it had a lot of communists in it, and the fascist General Franco, who'd been in North Africa, took his army from North Africa, went back to Spain, was trying to establish a fascist dictatorship in Spain. And so all over the world, Germans who had fled from Germany, they decided they were going to fight against Franco in Spain, and they formed the Thälmann Battalion, or the Thälmann Column, which was in honor of Ernst Thälmann, their leader in prison in Germany. They formed their own fighting division to go fight in Spain. And they wrote a song, the anthem of the Thälmann Battalion. It's a beautiful song. It is an absolutely beautiful song. I had never heard it until I was like 23 years old. And when I heard it, I said to these other communists, wow, I've just heard this song. And these old communists that I knew, they said, oh yeah, everybody knew that song. Again, if you were in the CP, in the Communist Party, you knew these songs, right? But they've been kind of eradicated. The Thälmann Cologne song, the song of the Ernst Thälmann Battalion, right? All the anti-fascist volunteers from around the world who went to Spain to fight against Franco, they all had their own anthem that they sang. And the Americans, they were called the Abraham Lincoln Brigade. But the German communists, they were the Ernst Thälmann Battalion. And their song was called Freiheit, which means freedom in German. I cannot find a version of it that I can play on here in English because of the fact, the obnoxious fact that the only English version is Pete Seeger, and Pete Seeger is unbelievably strict with copyright. So I cannot play the Pete Seeger version of it. And I'm going to play it in German for you. But before that, I will just sing it. Right. And I will just sing like one verse of it. I'm not a good singer, but I'll just sing it to you. Spanish heaven spreads their brilliant starlight far above our trenches in the plain. From the distance, morning comes to greet us, calling us to battle once again. Far off is our home, yet ready we stand, fighting and winning for you. Freedom. Right? That's the anthem. It's a very great anthem. Or Freiheit is how you say freedom in Germany. Freiheit. Right? And it's an optimistic song about fighting against fascism. And it became, again, communists all over the world sang it. I first heard this song. I heard it on a communist album. Right? And I mentioned it to an older woman I knew who was a communist. And she said, oh, I sang that song at YMCA camp when I was a kid. And I was like, YMCA camp, right? So she grew up in Brooklyn, New York, and she was not in a communist family. She was just a Jewish woman in Brooklyn, New York. And it was during McCarthyism. And the Communist Party was completely illegal, but in her neighborhood, they had YMCA summer camp. And she went to YMCA summer camp, and at YMCA summer camp, they sang, and the people running the YMCA summer camp must have been communists because they sang Freiheit, and they sang all these old communist songs. And that shows you how integrated the Communist Party was into Brooklyn, New York, right? That she just went to YMCA camp, and, she and all the other kids, they all sang Freiheit, right? So in the movie that they made of the life of Ernst Thälmann, there's a scene where he gets a letter from Maxim Gorky, the famous Russian novelist, a letter to him encouraging him to not be afraid in his jail cell. And then it shows the Thälmann Battalion while they sing this anthem. So this is a very inspiring scene from the Ernst Thälmann movie.
Der Augenblick wird kommen, da alle Herzen wie eine Flamme auflodern und den Faschismus ausbrennen werden. Maxim Gorky.
Bataillon Pariser Commune. Maurice. Vous avez vu juste à temps. Pasaremos. Adelante. Vorwärts. Im Geist Ernst Thälmanns.
Der Augenblick wird kommen, da alle Herzen wie eine Flamme auflodern und den Faschismus ausbrennen werden.
Yeah, that is a great song, by the way. I absolutely love that song. I never would have heard it because it's too Stalinist. Like, folk singers won't sing it, right? Won't touch it. You have to really know communists to know that song. But it's a great song, right? Freiheit, right? Very beautiful. Spanish heaven spreads their brilliant starlight, you know. Yeah. Yeah, the verse is the second verse is right, will not yield a foot to Franco's fascists, even though the bullets fall like sleet. We're standing together as brothers, and for us there can be no defeat. Far off is our home, yet ready we stand, fighting and winning for you. Freiheit. Yeah, it's really Freiheit, right? It's a very, very epic song. Now, Ernst Thälmann, they kept him alive until almost the very end of World War II because of the fact that he was a bargaining chip, right? The Nazis were really hoping that they could cut a deal. When it was clear that they were going to lose the war, they were desperately trying to make a deal with the Soviets so they could stay in power, that they weren't going to have it. They'd killed 27 million Russians, and the Russians were marching into Germany. They were done, right? The Nazis were losing. They kept him alive because they were hoping that they could like make a deal and give him to Stalin, give him to the Soviet Union in order to stay in power. It wasn't going to happen. And so finally, towards the end of the war, he was killed. And there was actually massive work stoppages all over Germany when it was announced that he was killed. Because the communists had so much support. I mean, and that's the one thing. Again, this is the untold story of World War II. All over Germany, there were communist sympathizers working in factories, inside the military, who, I mean, there was so much, there was so much, underground communist resistance inside of the Nazi state. If it hadn't been for that, World War II, would have gone a different way. There was a massive, we're talking millions of people that were spies for the Soviet Union, that were working to send information to the Soviet Union, that were, they had people in every factory, everywhere. There was a massive underground resistance organization. And when Ernst Thälmann was killed, the communists caused work stoppages, and there was like a national strike in Nazi Germany when the leader of the communists was killed. And after World War II, you had the German Democratic Republic, East Germany, and they made Ernst Thälmann into like kind of the national martyr, the symbol of German communism. And so they made this film glorifying his life. And then one of the patriotic songs was the Thälmann Lied, the Thälmann song. And then the communist youth group in East Germany was called the Thälmann Pioneers after Ernst Thälmann. So this is scenes from the movie that they made in 1955 about Ernst Thälmann, the leader of German communism, who had died. He'd been shot after spending like a year or a decade in Nazi prisons. And then this is the Thälmann volunteers. And then this is the Thälmann Lied. This is the epic, movie they made about his life, and the song, the Thälmann Lied.
Einen Finger kann man brechen, aber 5 Finger sind eine Faust.
Heimatland reckt deine Glieder, kühn und befragt ist das Jahr. Breit in den Schultern steht wieder Thälmann für uns, wie gepeinigt, blieb er uns treu und hielt stand. In seinem Namen gereinigt, kämpf um dein Leben, mein Land.
Zellwand und Zellwand vor allen, Deutschlands unsterblicher Sohn. Zellwand ist niemals gefallen, Stimme und Faust der Nation. Zellwand ist niemals gefallen, Stimme und Faust der Nation.
Dass ihre Waffen zerbrechen, schirmen wir Brücke und Wehr, geben der Welt das Versprechen, standhaft zu bleiben wie er.
Zellwand und Zellwand vor allen, Deutschlands unsterblicher Sohn. Zellwand ist niemals gefallen, Stimme und Faust der Nation. Zellwand ist niemals gefallen, Stimme und Faust der Nation.
Träumen und drängen und bauen, wird auch der Rhein wieder frei. Brechen den Feinden die Klauen, Thälmann ist immer dabei.
Zellwand und Zellwand vor allen, Deutschlands unsterblicher Sohn. Zellwand ist niemals gefallen, Stimme und Faust der Nation. Zellwand ist niemals gefallen, Stimme und Faust der Nation.
Das Wertvollste, was der Mensch besitzt, ist das Leben. Es wird ihm nur ein einziges Mal gegeben. Und benutzen soll er es so, dass er sterbend sagen kann, mein ganzes Leben, meine ganze Kraft habe ich dem Herrlichsten auf der Welt, dem Kampf für die Befreiung der Menschheit gewidmet.
Yeah, that's Ernst Thälmann. And in East Germany, he was very much the icon. I mean, I don't really want to talk that much about post-World War II Germany. Just a couple things, since we're talking about German communism tonight. After World War II, the CIA program that I've talked obsessively about on these streams was the Congress for Cultural Freedom, where the CIA started subsidizing leftists to be anti-communist, and they reinvented leftism. A really big part of that is what's called the Frankfurt School. And you get all these right-wing folks that think the Frankfurt School is somehow the same as the Soviet Union. It wasn't, right? The Frankfurt School was like a Marxist education center that was originally aligned with German communists. After the Second World War, it got rebooted, and it was funded by the CIA and by British intelligence. And a lot of American academic Marxists who were tied in with intelligence, like Herbert Marcuse and Theodore Adorno, set up shop and were part of it. And it was like a place that all kinds of like leftist academics went, and they said things that were very, very opposed to genuine communism. Theodore Adorno, and the way it was subsidized by the CIA was they set up a magazine called Der Monat. And Der Monat was funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom, which is now admitted to have been a CIA program. They had Paris Review in France. They had Encounter magazine in Britain, which was run by Irving Kristol. They had Partisan Review in America, but in Germany they had Der Monat. And Theodore Adorno and Herbert Marcuse and others, they were with the Frankfurt School. And they're the ones, they came out with this theory. They said it's not the working class that is revolutionary, it's intellectuals. They said it's a struggle for control of cultural institutions. The other thing is that they came out with this piece of crap book that I often hold up on these streams because I hate it so much. This awful, awful book called The Authoritarian Personality. The problem isn't capitalism. Fascism just flows from this certain type of personality called the authoritarian personality. Some people are just authoritarian. I don't know. And the kind of person who would join a mass movement, the kind of person who believes that right and wrong exist, the kind of person who feels a lot of passion, they have the authoritarian personality. And it's very, very dangerous. And you read this, this was funded by like all kinds of Jewish organizations. It was funded, who I guess were genuinely interested in funding research and why the Holocaust happened and trying to prevent it. It was funded by the school, what do you call it? The Tavistock Institute. Yes, that comes up in a lot of conspiracy theories, but they did actually fund it. And it was Theodore Adorno, and it was funded by the Congress for Cultural Freedom. And they did this whole study where they interviewed a bunch of former Nazis, and they came up with a theory of the authoritarian personality. And they admit that somebody with an authoritarian personality could become a Roman Catholic, could become a communist, but that's the problem, is these authoritarian personalities. And it's also really bizarre. They also, in this book, they cite Wilhelm Reich. All right, why didn't we talk about that? Wilhelm Reich. Okay, so Germany, before Hitler came into power, it was the center. There was a big communist party there. It was also the center of psychoanalysis. Sigmund Freud was from Austria, and Freud had a very big following, and a lot of Germans were into Freudian psychoanalysis. One big German guy who was really into psychoanalysis and was also a member of the Communist Party was Wilhelm Reich. And Wilhelm Reich had his own organization called Sexpol, right? Stood for sexual politics. It was called Sexpol. And Wilhelm Reich had his group Sexpol, and they went around selling contraceptives door to door and pamphlets about contraception and free love. They were an organization that promoted sexual promiscuity, right? And they were aligned with Sigmund Freud, and they were aligned with the Communist Party. And they were basically a nonprofit that went around door to door in Germany selling condoms and selling pamphlets about, having sex and things like that. And, pamphlets. They were just this sexual freedom activist group that existed in Germany that was very well funded. They raised money from a lot of wealthy people. The big guru of it was this guy named Wilhelm Reich, who was a psychoanalyst, a follower of Sigmund Freud, and he was a member of the Communist Party. So that existed. And then when Hitler came to power, Wilhelm Reich had this brilliant idea, and he wrote a book called The Mass Psychology of Fascism. And the German Communist Party read it, and they said, this is complete crap, and they expelled him. And Sigmund Freud read it, and he said, this is complete crap, and kicked him out of psychoanalysis. And Wilhelm Reich fled to New York City. And he ran Sexpol out of New York City, and he had his following in New York City, and he taught at New School University. He taught psychology, and eventually he moved all his followers to like Maine or someplace in New England, and they had like a city that they founded, and it was just this little free sex psychoanalytic communist group that they set up, right? And the book that Wilhelm Reich published, The Mass Psychology of Fascism, which is cited as a credible work in authoritarian personality, is one of the kookiest books I've ever read. It basically says people became Nazis because they're turned on. And it says that the Nazi salute looks like an erection. It says that the swastika looks like two naked bodies having sex. That Hitler's speeches are very sexual, and they have climaxes in them. I mean, imagine that. And so women are turned on, and that the reason people are becoming Nazis is because they're sexually repressed. And if only the German people would just allow pornography and be more sexually open, no one would be a Nazi. But because the German people are suppressing their sexual desires, because parents won't let their children masturbate, and because pornography is not allowed, that's what's causing all these German people to, they're suppressing their sexual desires, so they're becoming Nazis. That's what it's based on, right? That basically that German men really want to masturbate, but they can't, and so they go to Nazi rallies, and Nazi rallies turn them on, but they don't realize they're being turned on, and that's where it comes from. And it's one of the kookiest and stupidest things I've ever read. It's really, really crazy. And this book was taken seriously by American academia, and this guy was a big shot at New School University, and he was very widely respected. And he pretty quickly, the Communist Party kicked him out, and he was very much against communism because communism wouldn't embrace his free sex agenda. And homosexuality was illegal in the Soviet Union. And actually, the Soviet Union promoted the idea that Nazism was rooted in homosexuality. And you don't hear a lot about that now. They've kind of, that didn't become politically correct. But if you watch the movie Spartacus, that was written by a communist, right? The screenplay was written by Dalton Trumbo. The novel was written by Howard Fast. The villain, Marcus Crassus, is gay, and it's supposed to be how evil he is, right? He's a fascist. He's the fascist who takes over the Rome and makes Rome a dictatorship, crushes the republic. Well, he's gay to show how evil he's supposed to be, right? And if you watch the movie Rome Open City, which was a movie kind of glorifying the communist resistance to Italian fascism, Rome Open City, there's also, a gay fascist villain. And Maxim Gorky is quoted as saying he said something like, if you kill all the gay people, there'll be no more fascists or something like that. That's a pretty awful thing to say. But, but that was widely believed in communist circles, was that fascism was suppressed homosexuality, right? And it was based on the fact that before Hitler came to power, he was very much associated with gay people. Ernst Rem, who had been the leader of the Nazi street fighting group, the stormtroopers, had been openly gay. And there were a lot of very middle-class gay men who joined the Nazi party because they were attracted to the ultra-masculinity of it. And they thought that the communists were dirty working-class people, and they liked ancient Greece, and they liked, naked statues of ancient Greek guys, and they liked the leather and the boots and all of that, right? And that's an aspect of Nazism that gets covered up. And it's an aspect of Soviet anti-Nazism that gets covered up. Nowadays, right? Nowadays, we think of fascists as being anti-gay. And they were. Once the Nazis were in power, they put gay people in concentration camps. They were, they had, pink triangles, the special logo on your concentration camp uniform if you were gay. They killed thousands of gay people in gas chambers. They were anti-gay when they came to power, but the fascist movement, the Nazi movement, when it started, was very, very gay. And the communists actually gay baited the Nazis, right? They had cartoons making fun of them, accusing the Nazis of being a bunch of gays, and that the Communist Party wanted to legalize homosexuality, but they did take the line. The Soviet Union and communists internationally did take the line. It was considered pretty standard until the 1980s for communists to say that homosexuality was bourgeois decadence. If you went to Cuba and you asked about homosexuals, they would say, we don't have any of those. That's a disease from capitalism. We don't have any. You went to China, you asked about homosexuality, they'd say, we don't have that. That's a disease from capitalism. That's a capitalist mental illness. We don't have that. Now that's changed. The communist world has largely changed. It was actually East Germany was the first communist country to embrace LGBT rights, right? And in East Germany, they decriminalized homosexuality. There were gay members of the German, the German Socialist Unity Party, the ruling party. So it's kind of interesting that, that these things existed. And, Wilhelm Reich, during McCarthyism, I mean, it appears that his group, right, the sex pole of Wilhelm Reich was some kind of U.S. intelligence counter gang, right? It was anti-Nazi. They fled to the USA. They were anti-fascist, but they were also very much, their whole thing was they advocated sexual promiscuity, and they were anti-communist also because the communists were socially conservative. And during McCarthyism, the FBI broke up Wilhelm Reich's organization pretty viciously. It was clearly a group that had been supported by the government. I mean, he, had a lot of funding to do his stuff. He was anti-communist, but, during McCarthyism, there was a big crackdown on pornography and a big crackdown on free love. And also, it was, they charged him with fraud. Basically, he was claiming that this magical machine he built, it captured the magical energy of orgasms or something like that. And it didn't, right? And there was apparently a relative of Albert Einstein who got involved in the sex pole organization of Wilhelm Reich. And so Albert Einstein himself inspected the machine. He said, this is bullshit. This guy's a liar. He's a con man. And the FBI, went after Wilhelm Reich, and he ended up going to prison. That's a very strange story. But when we talk about counter gangs, right? Sex pole was a counter gang that was created. It was like a psychoanalytical counter gang created, by, it was a weird, communist psychoanalytic sex free love faction that broke with communism, broke with psychoanalysis, and moved to New York City and set up shop in New York City. And throughout World War II, they were in New York City, and then the FBI broke them up. There are still people that follow them in New York City. They have an organization. I looked it up. There are still Reichians in New York City that are psychoanalysts. They're considered fringe. They're not respected by other psychoanalysts. Psychoanalysis is largely rejected by the psychology community, but so they're like a fringe within a fringe, right? But among psychoanalysts, Wilhelm Reich is considered a kook. But, psychoanalysis is largely not respected by psychologists. So they're like the fringe of the fringe. There are Reichians that still exist, and in the new left, a lot of the hippies really liked Wilhelm Reich because he was advocating free love. He was anti-communist, and, he was into UFOs towards the end. And I don't know, it's a weird example of an intelligence counter gang, basically. That's what Wilhelm Reich was. That's an aspect of German communism. But the Frankfurt School, right? They really had been pushed very hard in academia. If you go to college and you take philosophy, you study music theory, you're going to read this crap, right? This crap, the authoritarian personality, the CIA, anti-authoritarian, whatever they call it. The other thing that's interesting is in the 70s and 80s in Germany, there was an ultra-left adventurist organization called the Red Army Faction. That carried out terrorism and assassinations. It was kind of like the Red Brigades in Italy. It wasn't as widespread. The Red Army Faction, they were called, and people called them the Baader-Meinhof Gang. And it was a group of German Maoist communists who engaged in all kinds of assassinations and kidnappings and bombings. And they were very heavily controlled by intelligence agencies. That's very clear. And actually, one of their leaders was a guy named Horst Mahler. He went to prison for 10 years for being a leader of the Red Army faction. And after he got out of prison, he became a neo-Nazi. And he was a leader of the National Democratic Party, which is like the neo-Nazi party of Germany. And he'd been a leader of the Red Army faction, and he became an anti-Semite and a Holocaust denier and a neo-Nazi, basically, which is actually very interesting. So one of the leading neo-Nazis was a guy who was the leader of this like left adventurous terrorist group, the Baader-Meinhof Gang. And the Baader-Meinhof Gang, they were just this left adventurous communist terrorist group in the 70s and 80s in Germany that carried out a lot of terrorist activities. And one thing about the Baader-Meinhof Gang was that they liked Yasser Arafat. And they went to Palestine to get training from, or I think to Jordan, where the Palestinians were set up. And they got training from Yasser Arafat. And however, it's a Muslim country, and the Palestinians are Muslims. And they made a rule, women in one tent, men in another tent. Well, the leader of the Baader-Meinhof Gang wanted all the women in his tent so he could have sex with them. And he said, no, I'm going to have all the women in my tent. They're going to have sex with me while we're here to get military training from you. And the Palestinians said, okay, well, we're not doing that. And so they left. They stopped getting training from the Palestinians. I find that to be hilarious. And it's sad. And the other thing was one of the leaders of the Baader-Meinhof Gang, he went to prison. And Jean-Paul Sartre, Jean-Paul Sartre is a guy who quit the Communist Party, is the big philosopher, the big existentialist intellectual. The big existentialist intellectual of France, went to interview him in prison, right? Libération, which is one of the main newspapers in France, right? It's this big philosophical thing, right? They were going to interview this guy, and Jean-Paul Sartre sat down with the guy and found him completely incoherent and crazy. He was expecting this guy was a very sophisticated Marxist, and they would argue about whether terrorism was the way to do things. And the guy was a lunatic. He was a bumbling idiot. He was a drug addicted sex freak. He was just and that's actually in a lot of cases, right? It's very similar to how American media interviews Charles Manson. There are all these interviews with Charles Manson, and he's incoherent. He's a blathering fool because that's who he was used by somebody, right? Charles Manson did not become Charles Manson because he was so smart. He became Charles Manson because he was so stupid and somebody could use him, right? And he got drugged up and they used him. And that's, go and read the books that have come out about Charles Manson and Operation Chaos and all of that. And it's the same with this Baader-Meinhof guy. He was absolutely not, some brilliant Marxist intellectual who engaged in terrorism. He was a blathering fool that was being used by intelligence. And that's another thing to remember about Baader-Meinhof, and that's kind of interesting. So that's really all I've got about German communism. I just thought tonight it would be fun to do kind of an overview of German communism. But before I go, the way that I learned these German communist songs, the United Front song and Ernst Thälmann, there's a song for Ernst Thälmann, a song for freeing Ernst Thälmann, and also the Freiheit song, is I heard them first from Cornelius Cardew. So I put together a medley of Cornelius Cardew performing German communist songs. And so I'm going to put that on to kind of close this out. And if you've got any questions for the second half of the show, you can send them to me. There are 3 ways to send them. The questions for the second half of the show. Thanks to everyone who's already sent one in. Rumble Rants, Cash App. But the best way is to buy me a coffee. I'll answer questions in the second half of the show. So I'll put this medley of German communist songs with English lyrics by Cornelius Cardew on. It's 5 minutes. After that, then we'll do the roll call, and then I'll answer people's questions. So here we go.
He was out in front, his fist was raised to strike them. Brigades were growing thick and fast to take the battle forward. The flag was red and the fight was on. For our sturdy comrade Thälmann, raise your fist. Sound the alarm, the phony court has sentenced him to perish. But when the people of the world rise up to liberation, we'll snatch the axe that falls on him. For our sturdy comrade Thälmann, raise your fist. Dimitrov was in just this spot. The traitors thought they had him, but news was spread at lightning speed, and world opinion freed him. The world awakes, indignation flames, for our sturdy comrade Thälmann, raise your fist.
Spanish heaven spread their brilliant starlight high above our trenches in the plain. From the distance, morning comes to greet us, calling us to battle once again. Far off in the home, yet ready we stand. We're fighting and winning for you. Freedom! We'll not yield a foot to Franco's fascists, even though the bullets fall like sleet. To stand those peerless men are comrades, and for us there can be no retreat. We're up in the home, yet ready we stand. We're fighting and winning for you. Freedom! Freedom!
I love that music. I don't know why. I know it's kind of like, I don't know. It's kind of an acquired taste. Like I said, anything of Cordu's is acquired taste. Now, he didn't write those songs, so they're a little bit better. The lyrics, he's not jamming everything into a lot of the lyrics like he always does, because they're not his songs. They're German communist songs. But anyhow, let's do the roll call. Names and locations, and then I'll start answering your questions. So names and locations, who is with us tonight? Names and locations, I'll call you all out as I see you. Who is with us? Names and locations, who is with us tonight? We got Brutus Lee in Montreal. Names and locations, who's with us? Bendigo, Australia, David Fox. Welcome. Howdy. Alex in Brazil, Lana in SoCal, Phil in Brooklyn is in the house, Rice from Adelaide, Australia, Jenny in Cincinnati, Sam in Amsterdam, St. David's, Bermuda, Rory in St. Louis, John in Florida, the high desert of Southern California, Ryan in Kansas City, Auckland, New Zealand, Gabby in Chicago. Dare to struggle, dare to win. Gabby is always doing great stuff. Killian, good to see you, Killian. Killian in Milwaukee, good to see you. John McCarthy in Chicago, good to have you, John McCarthy. Always a pleasure to see you. Names and locations. Anybody else? Names and locations. Who is with us tonight? We got Kew Gardens, New York, Checkpoint Charlie. Good to have you with us. Anybody else? Always fun to have people. So, as I said before, the best way to send your questions is to send them as Rumble Rants. That is the best way, the absolute best way. The big announcement that we got today is that we have published a coffee table book of the CPI convention. It's very expensive, not going to lie. That's because every page is in color. It's full of pictures. It's quite expensive. It is for sale if anyone wants to get it. But if you come to our event on January 11th, you will get a free copy. We are publishing it as a record. We're going to have another convention next year in 2026. And we're going to publish another book. And I think the idea is that we will have a set of these to show a record of what our organization does, why we exist, etc. It's over 200 pages long. It's got the transcript of every speech. It's also got the Chicago sessions transcribed. It's also got, articles and, information about all the stuff CPI has done. And it's got a lot in it, right? It's basically just what CPI accomplished. It's the convention book. So if you want one, get one. I am having some copies printed. I'm going to be traveling soon, and so I'm going to have some copies printed soon, so I'll be able to hold one up on here to see what it looks like. And I know it's certainly out of the price range, but we will have them for free for people who come to our January 11th event, and it's part of just maintaining the records of our organizations. So we published a coffee table book. We're very, very proud of our coffee table book. I've already shipped it. I've put in the order to ship it to some of the speakers, some of the donors. And thank you to everyone who helped make our convention possible. You now have the book. Thank you to everyone who was there, right? And there's a lot of people in this. I mean, it's just a full transcript of everyone who spoke, everything. It's all in there. So, I can't wait to get my hands on the print copies of it. And it is now available. You got the beautiful Russian dance team that performed, Kalinka USA, that we hired to perform at the event. That's them on the cover there, and loads of pictures and all kinds of stuff. It's really glad we did it, and I'm going to keep doing that. I think that will become our new tradition, is that we have the CPI convention books to give a record of our organization. And we're also going to send them out to the branches. All the board will be coming into town for the January event, and they'll come home with a stack of these books in order to distribute, and show people, what our organization is like, and we'll have a record of what our organization accomplishes and does. I'm very, very proud of it. So, all right. So, what is it? Okay. So we got Gabby sent a super chat, and Gabby, the question that she sent in is, why do people always bring up Marx's dad or his personal life? Why do they act like the fact that Marx came from a wealthy family background somehow discredits him? Well, Gabby, part of the reason we're innovationists now, I don't care, right? Marx was wrong about a lot of things. I am not a dialectical materialist. He thought the revolution was going to happen in Germany, and it didn't. He thought colonialism was progressive. He supported the Mexican-American War, the American side on the Mexican-American War, because he thought it would bring capitalism to Mexico. Marx was wrong on a lot of points. And I'm not a Marxist, right? My philosophical view, I'm very spiritual. I am definitely not a dialectical materialist. I listen to Wallace D. Wattles, the Christian socialist, all day long, The Science of Being Great, Jesus, the Man and His Works. And that is definitely idealist and in opposition to the Marxist philosophy of dialectical materialism. Marx understood economics and the trajectory of human history very, very well. And I respect that. And, we take the good from Marxism, but we're innovationists. We're in a new phase. And and that's my critique. Yeah, if you're still doing the Marxism-Leninism thing, you're still doing the communism thing, you're still trying to claim you're the true inheritor. If Marx was alive, he would be in my organization. If you're stuck in that, yeah, you have to say Marx was good. But, Marx was a guy, and he said a lot of good things. He also said a lot of things I disagree with. End of story, right? He understood the problem of overproduction. He understood how humanity is striving to reach a higher plane, and he understood how humanity has the ability to reinvent its relationship with nature. He understood, the various modes of production. He understood what the flaws of the capitalist system were. He understood the direction human history is going in. He had some stuff he was on point with. But honestly, I will tell you that I draw heavily from Marx. I draw heavily from Freud. And I think Charles Darwin was right about a lot of things. But Marx, Freud, and Darwin were all wrong in that they thought mankind was an animal, and that their philosophies were all predicated on the notion that mankind is just another animal. And they looked at mankind as if it was just another animal that didn't have any spiritual, was just responding to stimuli, seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. I believe mankind is not an animal. And so Freud was right about a lot. I draw much more from Freud than I used to, but I still think Freud was wrong because I don't think man's an animal. I accept a lot of what Darwin taught, but I think he was wrong. He sees man as just another animal. I don't accept that, right? I accept a lot of what Marx taught, but I think he was wrong because he sees mankind as just another animal, and that we don't need to defend Marx on a personal level because he was wrong on a lot of points. And I believe that his dialectical materialist view is very flawed, honestly. I think that dialectical materialism leads to a very destructive mindset. And if you look at communists in the West right now, if you look at the communist governments around the world, Vietnam and Cuba and China, they've all moved away from the dialectical materialist approach. They may say they believe in it still, but they're promoting unity, they're promoting the family, they're promoting loyalty, they're not promoting competition and an endless battle. They're not doing that, right? Whereas communist groups, most of them have nothing to do with any of the communist governments, and they're all about conflict and struggle and vengeance and all of that. And that's, yeah, I'm here to say that the dialectical materialist worldview, I don't agree with it. And that is the foundation of Marx's view. So, yeah, who cares if Marx was wealthy? He himself was not very wealthy. He lived in very extreme poverty for most of his life, but he came from a wealthy family. His wife's family was much more wealthy than he was. And Frederick Engels was the guy who paid for Marx, basically. And Frederick Engels was from a very, very wealthy family. Frederick Engels, his father was a factory owner. So, people can say true things and, and do bad things. Bad people say true things, right? People can be hypocrites and still say true things, and I don't think Marx was a hypocrite, and I don't care, right? I heard Marx drove a Cadillac. Exactly. Like, who cares? Right? And this is the whole thing. This is a very, very, this is something people say about American culture, right? I had a college professor from Yugoslavia, right? And he said that he was very, very opposed to hunting. And he said, I'm very, very opposed to hunting. So, and then he pointed to us and someone shouted, but do you eat meat? And he said, of course. See, he said, that's America, right? He said, in no other country in the world, right, would someone get up in a philosophy class and say they're opposed to hunting. And then someone says, but do you eat meat, right? He said, maybe I do, maybe I don't. I can be a complete, total hypocrite, and my position can still be correct. But that's how Americans are. We always personalize it. It's one of the crass, cheesy things about our culture, right? You know, he's a philosophy professor. He maintains that hunting is not moral. If he eats meat, if he's a total hypocrite, that doesn't in any way debunk his position. But it's something we do in America, you know. Marx criticized the capitalist system where a small group of people become very, very rich. And so if we can show that his father was wealthy, or his wife's family was wealthy, or Frederick Engels, his benefactor, was wealthy, we got him. Well, first of all, the idea that wealth is bad is toxic. And I don't even think it's consistent with Marxism. If you read the Critique of the Goethe Program, the idea is that wealth made at other people's expense is bad. But Marx said the whole point of communism, the whole point of centralizing the means of production, is to create so much wealth that everyone lives to be so abundantly wealthy that we don't even need a government anymore. So wealth is not bad. So we're not against wealth, right? And this notion that Marxism is against wealth, it infuriates me. My whole life, right? The whole reason I never would have become a communist, I'll just tell you this, I never would have been a communist if I didn't hear stupid anti-communism my whole life. That is so easy to debunk. And I was told my whole life, well, no communist country ever had any economic success. They were all just poor and starving the whole time. And I discovered that the Soviet Union invented space travel. Yesterday was Sputnik Day, raised millions of people out of poverty, had the world's largest power plants. Well, if they hadn't lied to me, that wouldn't have mattered. But they said it never achieved anything. And look, and you know, and also what have I've been told my whole life, communists want to divide up everything absolutely equally. They want everyone to be paid the exact same wage, no matter how hard they work. No, they don't think that. And what infuriates me is I've spent my entire adult life explaining to people, no, you know, we want central control of the means of production. We want to create a society that's so abundant and wealthy that classes break down. But then we get goofballs like Zoran Memdani and Jabba the Vosh. Remember him? I really like horses. Right? Jabba the Vosh and all these people that are just exactly what I learned communism was when I was in school, but that's good. You know, it's like I've spent my whole life learning this stuff, trying to educate people about it. But no. Let's just be exactly the stereotype, exactly the caricature, but it's good, right? And then, of course, the argument is, well, that's not real communism, right? That's a real convincing argument, right? If communism everywhere it's ever been tried has led to nothing but death, starvation, misery, but it just wasn't real communism, that's the dumbest thing I've ever heard. It's one of the dumbest arguments. And I never would have considered it. I was like vaguely interested in socialism, but then I discovered that, oh, that's actually not true. The Soviet Union saved humanity from Hitler. They launched satellites into orbit. They lifted millions of people. They built a modern industrial country. China has lifted 800 million people out of poverty. Like that idea that communism just never accomplished anything, it's not actually true. And honestly, I became intoxicated with truth. There were certain realities I couldn't fathom because I was just so angry. I was just so angry at seeing that I'd been lied to about communism that I overlooked. And it took me visiting communist countries and being in communist groups to realize that communist countries don't do the Soviet thing anymore for a reason. Deng Xiaoping theory, the market reforms, all of that has been adopted for a reason. And communist groups are very, very dysfunctional. And they're, even in a big, huge economic crisis, they're not going to become leaders of the working class because there's a reason. And then it took me years. And the innovationism that we've developed, this new understanding, this new breakthrough, it took me years to develop it because for so long, I was intoxicated with truth. And this is a very dangerous thing that happens. A lot of people that are on the margins of politics, what it's based on is that they realize something that is true. Something that is true that society refuses to recognize. And so then they become blinded by that truth. They become so obsessed with this one thing that they know is true that no one else will acknowledge. And then they are unable to see other true things. And that is a reality. And I've seen that in other organizations that I've dealt with that are on the margins of American politics, is they know something to be true, and the society just won't acknowledge that. So then they lose their ability to process other information because they're so focused on the one thing that they do know is true that society won't acknowledge. Look, I've said this for a long time, and this is actually a good transition into the next question, but I said this for a long time. I'll just say this, right? We live in liberalism. liberalism is the society that we live in. Liberalism is the free market system, the democratic republic government, and liberalism is founded on the worship of the concept of individual rights and the rejection of collectivism. Right? That's the liberal ideology, the liberal view, the Western perspective is liberalism. We reject collectivism. We are for individual rights, individual liberties, and that's good, right? I'm glad we have freedom of religion. I'm glad we have freedom of speech, right? Liberalism was necessary. Feudalism was very repressive, and liberalism came along. But liberalism, as the ideology of the Western world, has gradually been taken to very extreme ways of being. And the liberal order is threatened by the fact that there are two illiberal instincts that will always be there among the population. I'm looking at this from like a psychological perspective, put economics and all that aside. There are two drives that human beings naturally have that will come up in a liberal society. The first drive is what you might call socialism, right? Is that people want the government to protect them economically, to make sure they're employed, to make sure they can put a roof over their head. But that is contrary to liberalism. Liberalism says, let the economy take care of itself, you're on your own. But, we do have a welfare state in this country. We do have, an FEC, and, we do have mechanisms to try and stabilize the economy, and people want more of that. And so communists are the bad example. Well, you can't demand that the government provide people jobs. You can't demand the government provide help. That's communism. Communism is held up as, there's something called communism, and it's very, very bad. So you better not demand the government get involved too much in the economy, or else you're a communist. And that's very, very bad. Communists are the one bad example of the one liberal impulse, illiberal impulse towards socialism, towards the government controlling the economy, which in a capitalist society, people are going to want that. People don't want to be unemployed. People don't want to be hungry. People want economic progress. And so people are going to consistently say to the government, fix the economy, make sure that we're taken care of. And so communism is held up as the bad example, the boogeyman. Don't do that. Communism is the boogeyman. So that's the one illiberal impulse. The other illiberal impulse is tribe and tradition, right? And I'll just be honest, I'm not saying this is good. This is just a fact, right? People tend to divide themselves into groups and to be loyal to their group, right? If you are white, you tend to be somewhat biased and loyal to other white people. If you're black, you tend to be somewhat biased and loyal to other black people. If you're a man, you tend to be somewhat biased and loyal to men. If you're a woman, you tend to be somewhat biased and loyal to women. People are loyal to their own team, their own tribe. On top of that, there's tradition, right? Traditional family, traditional morality, religion, rules, and all of that. And being loyal to your own team, your own tribe, your own demographic, your own ethnic group, Irish people like Irish people, Jews like Jews, Czechoslovakians like Czechoslovakians, right? That's not liberal, right? We're all supposed to be individuals. And on top of that, traditionalism, right? The traditional family, traditional religion, these things also are not liberalism. They're not radical individualism, right? So, what do we have as the bad example of being too tribal or too traditionalist? We have fascism, right? And if you start to be too loyal to your group and all that, don't be like that. That makes you a fascist. If you start being too traditional, too socially conservative, don't be that. You're a fascist, right? And so fascism and communism in liberal society have basically become the boogeyman. And communism is the boogeyman to make sure you don't demand too much socialism. And fascism is the boogeyman to make sure you're not too conservative. And gradually, we're going to be less and less conservative because we're just becoming more integrated. So the tribe and tradition impulse is becoming less and less. Whereas capitalist economics is constantly revolutionizing the means of production, and technology is constantly advancing, which means that the tendency of the falling rate of profit and the problem of overproduction is getting worse. So the economy is becoming less and less stable. So the impulse towards socialism is going to become more and more and more. So the reason that fascism is considered right-wing or conservative is because it represents an impulse that is fading. We are much less traditional than we used to be. We're much less tribal than we used to be. Whereas socialism is considered progressive and leftist because it represents an impulse that is becoming more and more necessary the more unstable things become. But basically, in America, in the West, communism and fascism have turned into the bad example of two illiberal impulses. They don't really represent it. People that are attracted to communism are not attracted to Marx's ideology. They're attracted to their impulse. And people that are becoming fascists are not attracted to fascist ideology. They're attracted to their impulse, right? That we all have illiberal impulses that are naturally within us. We all want the economy to be organized in a way that we don't have to be worried about unemployment. We all kind of tend to like people that are like us and tend to want to stick with the traditions we grew up with and the traditional way of doing things, right? And so to police that, they've created a boogeyman in our head of the fascists and the communists to scare us out of our illiberal impulses. And there are a minority of people who become, in liberal society, become communists, and they're allowed to exist, but there's an understanding with them that the liberal order has. Okay, you can be communists, but your job is, instead of fighting the liberal order, your job is to go around making sure no one obeys their opposite, their tribe and tradition impulse. And your job as the communists is to go around demanding that people abandon their tribe and tradition impulse. And there are people who become fascists in liberal society, and the liberal order has an arrangement with them. It says, okay, you can be fascist, but your job is to go around demanding that people fight against their communist and socialist impulse, wanting the government, right? And that communists and fascists exist to protect the liberal order from each other, right? And that they both represent not actual fascist or actual communist ideology, but just a a boogeyman created in our minds. And some of us are so, our socialistic or our conservative tribal impulse is so intense that we become communists or we become fascists. And then the state has an arrangement with us that, okay, you can do that as long as your job is going around fighting this opposite. And that's the arrangement the liberal order has, right? And that's how Western politics works. The far right goes around fighting socialism. The far left goes around fighting tribe and tradition, and the far left pretend they're communists, but they're not. They're just people with a very socialistic impulse. And the far right pretend they're fascists. They're not. They're just people with a strong tribal and traditional impulse. And they're kind of used, and that's the liberal order, right? And that's how American and Western politics is set up. And this is probably very offensive to a lot of people, right? And I apologize if this is offensive to you. I'm just telling you how it is, right? And a lot of people on the left, they have this delusion. Oh, no, the far right are all agents. No, they're not. They throw those people in jail. They blow them up. They kill them. And a lot of people on the far right say, oh, all the government, all the elites, they're all communists. No, they're not. No, they're not. They invade and destroy communist countries. They toppled the Soviet Union. They're not all communists, right? But neither the far left nor the far right are actually fighting the system. They are protecting the system from impulses and organizations of the other side, which also don't represent that, right? And that innovationism is neither the boogeyman of communism nor the boogeyman of fascism. We are a new movement that is actually trying to put forward. We're not going around telling people to push back against their against their tribe and tradition impulse. That's not what I'm trying to do. I don't like racism, and I don't want anyone to be bullied. People have the right to be who they are, but it is not my job to protect the American liberal order from people who might think things that are traditional or tribal. Likewise, it is not my job to go around protecting the free market from people's desire to have the state protect them economically. We are building a movement calling for a government of action to fight for working families. That's what we're doing. We're not protecting the liberal order from anybody. We're opposing the liberal order. We're saying that the needs of the American people should come first, and this system of globalism, imperialism, is a threat to all of us, and that the American people should come together to beat back the power of the big banks and corporations that are marching us toward World War III in a low-wage police state. We're not playing into this stupid political game that they've set up where we have a far left to police the one side and a far left to police the right side. No, we are rejecting liberalism entirely. We are rejecting liberalism. We're saying human beings are collective creatures, and the American people need a government that fights for working families against the globalists and the big monopolies and their liberal system, right? And we have a 4-point economic plan, and we're building a movement of people who love their country and love their communities and oppose this satanic imperialist global order. And we're not part of the game. We're not part of the game. We're not on their stupid hamster wheel, right? And if you're far left or far right in America, you're on a hamster wheel. That's what you're doing. You're on a hamster wheel. And I was on a hamster wheel as a far leftist for many, many years, but I refused. I just wouldn't follow the script. I took the ideas seriously, and so they labeled me far right. But all the people on the right know that I'm not right wing. I'm not an advocate of racism. I don't have a problem with gay marriage, abortion, gay marriage. That's not my business, you know? And I'm not far right and I'm not far left. I'm just a sincere anti-imperialist, a sincere illiberal, and I'm not willing to get on the hamster wheel. And that's what you do. If you join a communist group, you get on a hamster wheel. If you join the far right, you get on a hamster wheel. I'm not on a hamster wheel. CPI means not being on a goddamn hamster wheel. That's what we're doing. We're building a political movement that's not part of the hamster wheel. We're building a movement demanding a government of action that fights for working families, a government that fights for working people against the big monopolies. We're opposing globalism, imperialism. We want to embrace the new rising economy in Eurasia. That's the movement that we're building, right? And that's the movement that this country urgently needs. And building such a movement means not being on the hamster wheel. I hope that that's a good explanation. I hope that's helpful. But I just wanted to say that. So the other thing I wanted to mention while we're here, while we're here tonight, one thing I did want to mention is that the next question, right? The next question. So Leo Messi says, it seems as if the leaders of Vietnam and Laos are going to North Korea soon. Yes, I saw that announced on social media as well. And then he says, the idea that Vietnam is subservient to the USA seems to be a myth. Yeah, Vietnam's not subservient to the USA. There is tension between Vietnam and China. There's tension. And the reason for that tension, first of all, there's ethnic differences that go back thousands of years. On top of that, though, after the Vietnam War, there were islands that Vietnam claims that China, that are part of China, right? There are some disputed islands in the South China Sea. On top of that, China, over the course of the Vietnam War, pivoted into the U.S. camp. And Vietnam was Soviet aligned. And after the Vietnam War, Pol Pot was backed by China and the United States to attack Vietnam. And there was the Kampuchea War of 1978. Where China invaded Vietnam to support Cambodia. And that was an epic disaster where communist governments were killing other communist governments. And it was arranged by Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski. And it was part of their strategy of dividing the anti-imperialists. China had been badly screwed over by the Soviet Union. Khrushchev pulled out all the aid, and they were, badly, and they pivoted into the U.S. camp over the course of the 1960s. By 1969, they were starting to align with the United States. In the 70s, it became very blatant. China was aligning with the United States, and part of that meant aligning with the U.S. in terms of foreign policy. Vietnam was Soviet aligned. And so there was a war between China and Vietnam in 1978, the Kampuchea War. And so Vietnam and China, there's rivalry there. China and Vietnam, they have a very thriving trade relationship, but Vietnam has hosted U.S. battleships before. And that's one thing that there's kind of a push and pull on. But Vietnam was pivoting in a very anti-China direction, but that shifted. That shifted pretty quickly. And now China and Vietnam are getting along much better. The islands are still disputed, and there's still tension there. I mean, there's an ethnic tension that's gone on for thousands of years. But that said, at this point, Vietnam and China and North Korea are strongly supporting Russia. And Vietnam has a strong socialist economy, and Vietnam, they've had an economic miracle with the same kind of economic policies that China has. They call it the socialism-oriented market economy. And so there you go. Vietnam is not a puppet of the United States. It never has been. But there is, China is a country that they have a complicated relationship with. And so there have been times they've pivoted into the U.S. camp because of that. But now Vietnam is pretty clearly on Russia's side in Ukraine. And they're about to, visit North Korea. And yeah, Vietnam is not a puppet of the United States. It's a socialist country. It's an anti-imperialist socialist country with its own foreign policy and a history of tension with China. Hope that is helpful. Hope that is helpful. The way that one can send questions, the best way to send questions is via Buy Me a Coffee. That's the best way to send questions. So if you've got a question you'd like me to answer, I am going to put on some more music and refill my glass of water, and then I'll start answering more questions. So I'm just going to put on, this is, since I played a Cardew song earlier, this is one of my favorite Cardew songs, right? And I actually used, it's the words of the last official statement of Mao Zedong, defeat U.S. imperialism and its running dogs, but it's put to music, and it's the first paragraph of that statement. And I actually have used those words as a mantra at the end of these streams. And this is, Cardew's song, Revolution is the Main Trend. I'm going to put that on while I refill my water, and then I will answer any questions. Best way to send questions is via Buy Me a Coffee. Here we go.
Countries must get prepared. But revolution is the main trend in the world today. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, and the people of various countries have been continuously revolutionary wars to defeat the aggressors. The danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of our countries must get prepared. But revolution is the main trend in the world today. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression, and the people of various countries have been continuously revolutionary wars to defeat the aggressors. The danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of our countries must get prepared. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. A new upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. Revolution is the main trend in the world today. The danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of our countries must get prepared. But revolution is the main trend in the world today. Revolution is the main trend in the world today.
All right. So I'm going to start doing the Buy Me a Coffee questions that have come in. The first one came in this afternoon, and so I'll just read it. Ian says, hey, wondering if it's possible to ask questions from EU-friendly time. The answer is absolutely yes. Yeah, if you want to send questions like you did, I'll answer it on the next stream. And if by sending this, you'll respond on the next live stream, yes. And then his question is, you talk about the rich and the ultra rich, and that they have different agendas. I want to ask if you know why the rich don't come out and name the ultra rich all the time as opponents. I think people would eat it up. Well, Ian, they do. They do. Go and read the John Birch Society, one of the main right-wing organizations in America. Their blue book that they wrote is all about how they think the left and communism is a Wall Street conspiracy. Go and listen to any right-wing podcast. They start yelling about the World Economic Forum and how much they can't stand the World Economic Forum. Listen to, I mean, they know the ultra rich are their enemies. They just, they don't call them that. They call them the globalists or whatever, but they are all very rich people who sit at the head of corporations and have huge institutions and think tanks to push their perspective. But yeah, they name the richest of the rich and the most powerful, corporations and bankers as their enemies all the time. They do that all the time. I will say that the reason they may not put it in those words is because they have this anti-communist hangup, right? That they can't sound like a communist. Wealth is good, and they are themselves wealthy, So I don't know, but yeah, you read far right literature. They're always talking about the richest people, the bankers, the globalists. There's always a group of ultra rich people that control international institutions that are the richest of the rich. And a lot of times they don't like them because they're Malthusian. Also, they understand that they're Malthusians, but somehow they're all communists also, because everything in any way slightly left wing is communist, right? And that's generally the Bircher perspective in America, right? Is that, well, the Rockefellers are communists because they believe in birth control. Well, they believe in birth control because they want to drive down the population, but birth control is not Christian, right? It's not something conservative Christians want. So therefore they're communists because they're not conservative Christians, right? It's that kind of mindset that everything's slightly liberal, anything that is not screaming anti-communism at the top of its lungs, everything that's opposed to what a conservative would think is de facto communism, right? It's they don't see nuance to their left. Everything to the left of them is the same, right? And it's a very shallow worldview. It's very limited, right? But, most of the people who call themselves communists in America don't even support communist governments and are actively working against the communist governments. People don't understand that, right? You commonly hear Democrats saying, well, all these woke people, they're all Marxists, and that means they're all working for China. They hate China. These people cheer for the Dalai Lama, free Tibet. They hate China, right? But China is Marxist, and so they must be Marxist. I mean, it's a problem, right? It's when you have a fringe political view, right, that puts you at odds with the bulk of the establishment, you tend to lump the other side altogether, right? When I was around communists, I would hear them talk about the ultra right wing, and they'd be talking about some Republican. It's like they don't, I don't know. You tend to know your own political neck of the woods really well, and then you see the other neck of the woods is all just a big cabal. They're all in it together. A lot of the far right wing, they don't understand that there's not one communist party. A lot of them have this old, outdated Cold War view that the Communist Party, there's one Communist Party, and the Democrats are in it or something, and that's during the Cold War, there was a Communist Party USA that was the US wing of the Soviet aligned movement. And a lot of conservatives couldn't understand that there were different communist groups that didn't agree. They thought all the communist groups were just different wings, right? And that's a really common thing. If you watch the movie Network, which is a 1970s movie, right? At one point they make it appear as if the Communist Party and the Symbionese Liberation Army are the same organization. And it's like, there's a very much a naivete there, right? That in the right wing worldview, communism is just this big thing. I will say, there's this one woman who's getting a lot of play right now, and whatever. I don't know. She does, and she's been around for a while, and I pay attention to this kind of stuff. And she has a YouTube channel. I forget what her name is. It's something Eastern European sounding. And she, for a while, her thing was she would do Socialism Saturday. And she would show clips from PSL's YouTube channel. She had some special inside information. It was very annoying. And I got on one of her streams and I was in the chat and I said, PSL is funded by billionaire Roy Singham. And she said, you can't say it. And she just started flipping out. Oh, you can't say that on here. You can't spread conspiracy theories. I'm thinking this is widely understood. And she's like, I'm going to mute you. And she just had a meltdown because I said that in her chat. And I'm just like, excuse me, and that's something that's on Fox News. They widely understand that People's Forum, Party for Socialism and Liberation, is backed by Roy Singham. That is fact. Right. And I just said that in her thing. And she's showing videos that are readily available on YouTube and being like, this is what the far left is doing. I've infiltrated, and I'm just going on there. I'm just saying basic things, basic knowledge, like who pays for PSL. And she's flipping out that I'm spreading conspiracy theories and all this. So now this woman's thing is that, oh my God, Antifa, she infiltrated Antifa. She knows all about it. And it's so cringe and embarrassing, and it's infuriating to me because I've lived this. You know what I mean? I was on the far left. I got canceled by the far left. I've lived this, and I understand this stuff with some depth. And she's not educating anyone about anything. She's just doing conservative scare porn. That's all it is, right? It's just, oh my God, did you know that there are these people out there that are communists? And I mean, it's just conservative scare porn that doesn't educate anyone about anything. And that's my whole thing about preaching without teaching. I mean, I've lived this. You watch these streams, I can tell you about all these groups. I can tell you what their flaws are. I can tell you all about it. But I'm not on here just telling conservatives they're all scum that want to take your children and trans them. I'm not going to say that. I'm going to tell you what they actually believe. But, that's dangerous, right? And that just people don't want to be educated. People just want their pre-existing bias to be reinforced. That's a big problem with social media. Right, is that, if you want to be popular on social media, just find a way to say what a bunch of people already think in the most shrill, over-the-top way, right? Don't teach anybody. Don't challenge anybody. Don't give them new information. Just take people's pre-existing bias and amp it up, right? I hate these communist groups more than anybody because I was among them. And I saw the holes in how they view things. I took their ideas too seriously, and they then viciously went after me, And so I know if anyone should be talking about what these groups are like, I am. But, I'm going to do it in a way that people actually learn something, and no one wants to learn anything, So that's why CPI exists, to educate people. We actually want to educate people, right? We're not just grifting money on social media. We're actually trying to teach people and build a group of people who can intervene in history. And that's the whole thing. Come to our event in January. I'm working on a great presentation. We're going to do great stuff. It's going to be awesome. Come to our event in January. I hope I can register you for it soon. But I hope that answers your question, Ian. All right. Now we're going to continue with the Buy Me a Coffee questions. Patricia Kinkle says, thank you for a great history lesson. Well, you're very welcome. And I saw your comment in the chat about cutting this. I will definitely cut this. Definitely cut this for you because that's why I did it, right? Sometimes I just go on here and just info dump basically and just kind of share what I know. So yeah, I'll definitely cut this, and thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. The point was to learn. That was the point. David Fox says, wasn't the Communist Party of China and the Communist Party of Indonesia the biggest parties outside of the USSR? Not in the 1930s. They were later, but not in the 1930s. I'm talking about before World War II. Yeah, the Communist Party of Germany in the 1920s. But yes, Indonesia, the Communist Party of China, right, eventually took power. After World War II, it was millions of people. And Indonesia, they were like the government practically. They were aligned. But yes, we're talking 1920s and 30s. Yes. The coup in Indonesia in 1965 is really horrendous. You read the details of what the U.S. government backed in Indonesia, how the military was violently overthrown, and it turned into a genocide against ethnically Chinese people. And Barack Obama's stepfather was heavily involved. It was a high-ranking Indonesian military person. Barack Obama's mother, Ann Dunham, was a researcher for the Ford Foundation and was involved in the CIA. And she married Lolo Soetoro. And Barack Obama's stepfather was a high-ranking Indonesian military dude who committed genocide against ethnically Chinese people. And they glossed over this. All the biographies, they make it sound like, Indonesia was this enlightened place. It's like Indonesia in the late 60s, there was a genocide going on. The government had been violently overthrown, and they started, slaughtering an entire ethnic group in the name of anti-communism. Look up the coup of 1965, and that's Barack Obama's grandparents. They ran the Bank of Hawaii that funneled the money to make the coup happen, was heavily involved in CIA operations in the Pacific. Barack Obama's mother. I mean, Barack Obama, his whole life story is tied up with CIA, all kinds of stuff. Well, it's funny that you say that, Gabby, right? It's funny that you say that. What most likely happened, we don't know, is that Lolo was beating the mother, right? Most likely. That's everyone. It's all but confirmed that Barack Obama's stepfather was beating his mother, right? Was a a wife beater, right? Domestic violence. That is widely understood to have happened, right? And that also is a similarity between the life story of Bill Clinton and Barack Obama, is they both were born to a single mom. Single mom got married to an abusive man. They were with the single mom, abusive man left. They were still with the single mom. So yeah, it's pretty sad story. Pretty sad story. But there's a certain type of mindset where Barack Obama and Bill Clinton were like aligned with their mother against the father, right? And again, this stuff is all very important when you come to the president, right? You and me, right? Sit on the couch, talk to a psychoanalyst about your life. No one cares except us. But for the president of the United States, it really does matter what makes him tick, right? And that I have pointed out many times that there is a weirdly similar biography to Barack Obama and Bill Clinton. Both didn't know their dads, were raised by single moms married guys who were abusive, and they left them. That's the same story. And they both developed public speaking skills. They both had a close relationship with their mother. They both were like kind of responsible for their mother's emotions, cheering up their mother, taking care of their mother. In Bill Clinton's case, we know that Bill Clinton has, what they call a whore goddess complex, where he sees some women as infallible and he sees other women as worthless, right? And that Bill Clinton, he gropes women. He's possibly a rapist according to some accounts, but he definitely is. He has no problem. He's got a history of being a sexual predator, basically, because on the one hand, he hates his mother. On the other hand, he worships his mother. And Hillary Clinton, he is terrified of. And he, bows before Hillary Clinton. He's utterly terrified of her. And they call that a whore goddess complex. And then a lot of guys that have strange relationships with their mothers. And it's actually a very, very weird thing. A lot of, sexual predators have a weird dynamic where on the one hand, they have absolutely no respect for women. They have no problem groping and touching and being, but on the other hand, some women, they're just utterly terrified and bow before. And it's like, women can't just be people. They're either whores or goddess. Right? They call it the whore goddess complex. And Bill Clinton clearly has that, right? He has a whore goddess complex, and Hillary Clinton is the goddess, and all the other women are the whores in his mind. And women are people too, right? And that, but this is psychoanalysis. And that's Bill Clinton, right? I don't see any evidence of Barack Obama having those proclivities, right? But there's a similar story. Trump and Bush have a similar life story in that they both had very high achieving fathers, right? George W. Bush, his father was George Herbert Walker Bush, a huge CIA director, oil company owner, eventually vice president, and then president of the United States. And George W. Bush was his son, who was an alcoholic, who was a cocaine addict, who was a complete screw up and tried to open multiple businesses and failed and had something to prove. Barbara Bush, George W. Bush's mother, even when he was president, said, I never thought George W. Bush would go anywhere. I always thought it would be Jeb Bush that would be president, right? I mean, George W. Bush was the screw-up failure son who had something to prove. Very interesting. Had something to prove. And that his persona as president was very much like his masculinity, but not just his masculinity, his credibility was always in question, right? He was constantly trying to prove, no, I'm not the failure. I'm not the failure. I'm not the screw-up son. And that's how they could control him, right? Jeb was low energy. He wasn't interesting. But W had something to prove, and that's how they were able to control him, right? And Trump is the same way. Trump's father, Fred Trump, was a very, very successful real estate guy in New York City, a very successful real estate owner. There's a Woody Guthrie song, the whole thing. The left has gone into great detail about how Donald Trump's father was a very, very successful businessman. And the young Donald Trump was a screw up, so much so that his dad kicked him out of the house and sent him to a military boarding school. right? It was basically, they had a military boarding school in upstate New York for young boys that are trouble, that are bad, that are like juvenile delinquents. And Trump was kicked out of his parents' house and sent to a military boarding school where, it was to straighten him out. And so then he went into adulthood, right? And he was a party boy. He was viewed as the screw up failure kid who had to send to military boarding school and, and all of this. And Trump, he's had something to prove his whole life, right? And that, there are many people that are wealthy like Trump, but Trump, they make fun of it. He was famous for desperately trying to get his name in the newspapers and, wanting to be, he was flashy. He was a flashy rich person because he had something to prove. And it's very interesting that both of the, four different presidents, their life story lines up with other presidents. I think that's fascinating. I think it's very, very, very fascinating. How did we get onto that kick? I don't know. Anyway, we were talking about Barack Obama's stepfather in the coup. That's how we got onto it. Morozka. In trying to understand why revolutions haven't happened in the Western world, Western Marxists come to the conclusion that Marxist-Leninist or Ba'ath revolutions aren't real revolutions, which is wrong. I cannot help but feel this is deeply racist and xenophobic. Western leftists won't admit it because their whole shtick is being socially progressive. As a result, they end up not supporting any remotely revolutionary efforts. Am I wrong to not want to associate myself with Western leftism, even if I am a Marxist-Leninist? Well, you're not wrong. You're not wrong. I don't, in my experience, Morozka, what the issue is, the whole thing about they won't admit that these countries have had revolutions. What that's about is that the governments that have come into being as a result of the Soviet Revolution, the Chinese Revolution, Cuban Revolution, they all get demonized. And these people are in denial about the fact that they just can't comprehend that a government, that they just don't understand that there will never be a socialism the New York Times is going to approve of. They just don't get it. They're convinced that the reason that the USA hated the Soviet Union, the reason the USA hates Venezuela and China is they just violated human rights. And if these communists could just take power and respect human rights, the USA would say, well, geez, well, you've overthrown us and kicked us out, but well played, good sir. You played by our rules. We will respect you and trade with you. We will not tell lies about you in the newspaper, and we shall see you as fair opponents. Oh boy. Well, that's not how imperialism works. And I've been to Venezuela, and I'll tell you, in Venezuela, they have bent over backwards to accommodate the opposition. They've got ads on the television. They have got marches in the streets. They've got TV networks that work for them. The opposition in Venezuela is more free. There's more free speech than you would ever believe. But yet, from the moment Hugo Chavez took power, brutal dictatorship. It doesn't matter. They will always call it a brutal dictatorship when they lose, right? That's the point. It's always a brutal dictatorship. And you have to realize that there's never going to be a socialism the New York Times is going to approve of. It's not going to happen. But these people are in denial about that. There has to be a way I can believe in socialism and still be on the same team as my college professors and mainstream media. I couldn't possibly believe in something that would they're cowards. They're whiny little cowards. That's what they are. They don't have the courage to say, you know what? What I'm seeing on TV is lies. They don't have the courage to say, you know what? What I've been taught in school is a lie. There has to be a way I can believe in like this idea of socialism, but not have to go against it. They're weak cowards and conformists. That's all it is. They're weak people. They're over socialized, and they don't have the courage to just say, you know what? CNN is lying. New York Times is lying. They don't have the courage to do that. They're weak. That's really all it gets down to. They don't have the courage. They don't have courage, right? And it's okay to think about socialism in a vague, abstract way, but not in a way that would cause them to be the only person in the class sticking up for Robert Mugabe, like I was so many times, or the only person in the class sticking up for Iran, like I was. They can't do that, right? That's all it is, right? They're weak. I mean, there's not much more to it. They're weak. And on top of that, I think part of the problem is that leftism, not socialism and communism around the world, but leftism in the West is a fetish for weakness. They oppose strength, period, right? They see themselves as weak. They are attracted to people they see as weak, right? They see minority groups as victims, right? They are attracted to people that are weak. They are triggered by strength. And these communist governments tend to project strength, and that scares them, right? So they see them as, oh, you're just like the bullies in America, right? Stalin was a big, mean, scary guy. It's, it's a certain mindset they've developed, right? So there's that, but we're innovationists at the Center for Political Innovation. We've entered a new stage. We're not leftists. We're doing something completely different. We're doing something completely different because leftism has become thoroughly corrupted. We're anti-imperialists, and we take the best from Marxism, socialist economics, historical progress, etc. But we reject dialectical materialism. We embrace the anti-imperialist camp. We understand that markets are part of building an anti-imperialist economy in our time. We have a whole new thesis. Go watch my video, like explain innovationism. We have a whole new way forward because if you try to be a Western leftist, if you try to be a communist in a Western country, you're going to end up on a hamster wheel. It's just, that's what I keep talking about. If you try to be a communist in the West, for a long time, I tried to hold on to the word. I tried to say, well, I'm a real communist and all that. I'm at the point I don't even waste my time. We're doing something different. We're doing something different. And we should just embrace it. And we have a name for it. It's called innovationism. But that's my background. And I've spent my whole life in these groups, and I'm telling you, they are ineffective, to put it that way. John McCarthy says, are there any videos from the day of action ready to show, or are they still being edited? They are still being edited. I'm still waiting for some to come in. Most of them are here, and I will have a whole video of the days of action to show. We did have a National Day of Action on October 4th. And I will have the full video soon. I just have to edit it all together, make sure that every city is represented. I'll have it all, and it'll be good. It was great, and great work to Gavin and John in Chicago who were out. Great work to people in Portland. Great work to people in Minneapolis. Great work to people in Chicago. Great work to people in Los Angeles. Great work to people in Boston. Great work to people in New York. We had an action in 6 cities. It was good that we did it. It was very, very good that we did it. I'm very proud of the work that we do. We get shit done as CPI. We get shit done, and we do it, and we're building a real movement. And join us. We are where it's at, and there's other people that are screwing around on the internet, and we're doing real shit. So there we go. Checkpoint Charlie says, my profile image is taken from Possession, an insanely metaphoric, intense 1981 movie I recently saw that takes place in West Berlin, intentionally as close to the wall as possible. The main theme seems to be different kinds of divisions and consequences. Often, I would find such material pretentious or unhealthy, but the over-the-top emotional energy and symbolism impressed me. Warning, the content can be really shocking. Has anyone else seen it? Any thoughts? I've never seen this movie. Possession from 1981. You said it's shocking and intense. I worry, that makes me think I shouldn't show a trailer. Normally, if someone did that, I would go and find the trailer, but you said it's shocking. I don't want to, have people wet the bed here, but you want to give us any more info on the movie? Has anyone else seen the movie? I've never seen the movie. Possession, 1981, takes place near the Berlin Wall. Never heard of this movie. Never heard of the movie. Not familiar. I'll have to check it out, though. It sounds interesting. Sounds very, very interesting. A lot of the, post-war cinema in Europe was very highfalutin and intellectual, but a lot of it had socialist or leftist themes. I really like Jean-Luc Godard. I really like La Chinoise, and I really like Tout va bien. And I really wish I could show on here the grocery store scene from Tout va bien. Jean-Luc Godard was this Maoist French filmmaker. He had a Maoist phase. He may have become something else, but Jean-Luc Godard, he made this movie Tout va bien, and you probably can't show it. It's copyrighted or something, but let me see if I can find it on YouTube. Tout va bien, grocery scene. The grocery store scene in Tout va bien is very powerful. It's not where we're at politically now, but it's very much It's very, very much about what's this? Okay, it's very much about, it expresses the political atmosphere of the time. And it's about the French Communist Party being seen as holding back the struggle. Yeah, I can't find it on YouTube, which means it's probably unable to be shown. It's probably copyrighted or something. But yeah, go watch Jean-Luc Godard's classic film Tout va bien. Watch the grocery store scene towards the end. It's quite powerful. It's very strongly making a statement, to say the least. So there's a link to this movie that Checkpoint Charlie was talking about. I don't endorse it because I haven't seen it, but it might be good. So David Fox has provided a link. So there we go. Emma Valentina says, great stream as usual. Really interesting points about Indonesia and the Obama family. Unfortunately, it's forgotten part of the world where Papua is still suffering today. By the way, Academic Agent, very intelligent guy, featured you on his channel. It would be great to see a crossover. Yeah, I'm fine. I would love to do that. I saw his video about what is a counter gang. It looks like he liked it. I'd be happy to go on his channel. He seems like a good guy. And, I follow him on Twitter. Just Twitter DM me. I'd be happy to engage with him further. Seems like an honest guy who, comes out of the right, but he likes what I have to offer. And we're not left or right at this point. And yeah, I would love to engage with him, have a chat with him sometime. That's what I said the last time someone brought it up. And that's what I'm saying again. He seems like a good dude who I could happily engage with. All righty. Academic Agent is the guy's name. And he did a review of this book. It was pretty good. I mean, he learned a lot from it. So there we go. All right, cool. All right, so we got a couple more Rumble rants. If the new right wanted to stop Muslim immigration, they'd support Cheruri and the China-Pakistan Economic Corridor and the Belt and Road Initiative. Well, again, that would require them to really understand the cause of mass migration, really understand economics, and most of the people that are engaging with the new right are not there. There are some smart people in the new right, but your typical new rightist just doesn't like immigrants, right? And it's like they don't like immigrants, and they have kind of a nationalist perspective. Why should my country be forced to bring in all these foreigners? This isn't what the country I grew up in. They're not. There's not a huge amount of depth, right? Is the thing, right? So yes, obviously, if they understood the root cause, they understood how China is a very prosperous country, but they don't have people from their neighboring countries all pouring into China. They would understand that economic development is the solution, but they don't understand that. It's not a matter of gotcha, right? I think your typical new rightist just doesn't know. And the bulk of the new right are imperialists. They're just imperialists with a slightly different agenda. Nigel Farage, one of his biggest critiques of the European Union is that it doesn't allow for free trade, right? Nationalists historically oppose free trade. Nigel Farage, he says that, the problem with the European Union is that there's not enough free trade. There's too many restrictions on free trade. Most of the new right, it's just a rival faction among the imperialists. That said, there's a division among the imperialists. That's an opening that we can intervene in, right? And that's, again, we're being smart about this. Every time I talk about divisions in the ruling class and they need to be strategic, somebody goes, yeah, but the other side is bad. Well, no shit, Sherlock. Yeah, but they're bad. It's like, okay, all right. Yeah, but they're bad. Oh, yeah, I know. But, we can just sit back and be on the internet and point at everyone and say they're bad. No, let's intervene. Let's try to change things, right? Let's see an opening and try to advance an agenda. And, people don't get that. The internet is a great place to just sit back and go, they're bad. But, that's not changing the world. That's living biologically. That's another form of living biologically, right? We talk about, a plant is alive, an animal is alive, but human beings transcend mere biological existence. We intervene in history. We challenge things around us. We wrangle with big questions. And if all you do is say that, point fingers and call people bad, bad exists, but the point is to try and make the world a better place. That's the point. All right. Okay. Hempcar said, what is it? Mexico anti-meme law could see Mexicans jailed for posting insulting images. Yeah, Okay. I mean, I've heard lately Claudio Sheinbaum is not going in a good direction. Gabby and Penny follow Mexican politics quite closely, so they can probably tell me more about that. But yeah, anyone else hear about this meme law in Mexico? I haven't really heard much about it. Yeah, I mean, I'm not surprised. Not surprised. Not surprised at all. So there we go. All right, folks. Well, we had a nice long stream tonight, almost 3.5 hours. It was great. Dare to struggle, dare to win. Join the Center for Political Innovation. We're doing great stuff. Thanks to everyone who was out in the streets on Saturday. It was really important that we intervened. It was really important that we did outreach and we spoke up. And I'm going to cut tonight's presentation about German communism. I'm definitely going to cut it. So don't worry. I will make that a standalone piece. And thanks to everybody. I mean, we do great stuff. I really love our organization and the work that we do. So, we just got to focus on doing our own thing. The less we think about other people, the better. I'm really inspired by North Korea. I mean, North Korea, their UN presentation was, look, we're just doing our own thing. The rest of the world, we're involved here, we're involved there, but, we're just doing our own thing. And that impresses me. And that needs to be the attitude of we're just going to build. We're just going to build, and we're just going to build our group. And we're just not going to get caught up in day to day. Look, I'm seeing the same stuff you all are seeing out of Chicago and ICE, and it's a mess. So that's why we just have to build. Like, what else can we do amid all of this? We just got to build. We have to build our own group. We have to build our own group. We have to build our own group. Right? There are times to intervene. We did a very effective intervention during the election with the Peace MAGA operation. But sometimes you just have to build. You just have to build. All right. Thanks, folks. New upsurge in the struggle against U.S. imperialism is now emerging throughout the world. Ever since World War II, U.S. imperialism and its followers have been continuously launching wars of aggression. But the people of various countries have been continuously waging revolutionary wars to defeat their aggression. And while the danger of a new world war still exists, and the people of all countries must get prepared, revolution is the main trend in the world today.